Hello, and welcome to the sixth installment of the Lawnchair Philosophy Foundation's Continental Chop Shop series, wherein we explore the fundamental notions around which conversations in the continental philosophical tradition revolve. During this installment, we will take a close look at the notion of historicity from various perspectives within the continental tradition. We'll begin with Husserl, then turn to Heidegger. We'll have Sartre, Beauvoir, and Ricoeur, and we'll hear about Merleau-Ponty's perspective, and then round things out with Fanon. We have with us Angela Heredia of Central European University, as well as Donovan Irven of Filo, Sofi Arts, and Analecta, Hermeneutica, and the enigmatic Spore, our visiting facilitator. Right, so I will go ahead and begin with some Husserl. Without further ado, let me pull up this presentation here so that I may read from it. Not like a robot, I hope. Okay. For Husserl, scientific judgment does not operate in a vacuum. Our past experiences and our cultural place in history shape how it is evidence appears. Even within pure sciences such as mathematics and theoretical physics, whose principles and methods seem universally applicable, the conclusions we scientifically draw about the nature of reality are never neutrally derived and always reflect some sort of subjective contribution that is motivated by the needs and styles of our place and time. However, Husserl does not want to commit to any sort of psychologism that reduces the laws of logic or any scientific practice to pathological caprice, nor does he want to commit to any sort of historicism that renders truth, whether scientifically or otherwise obtained, relative to cultural norms and values. Husserl is committed to the ideals of science, which strive after absolute certainty in the face of conflicting evidence and conclusions. And for Husserl, it is urgent for us to realize the living spirit of science in our everyday pursuits, to adequately fulfill those aims and sustain what makes us human, our rational empathy, so that we can come to harmonize the multifarious life worlds we each inhabit and determine for ourselves what it is we shall make of life. Though the operations of human reason are constituted through beliefs shaped by personal and collective history, Husserl claims that his radical scientific method, the phenomenological epoche, can uncover the absolute structures of conscious experience that condition objective validity for all of science, and robust truths about life itself that transcend personal and cultural circumstance, to reveal meaningful insights over the relationship between science and humanity's continuance. By exploring his notion of historicity, we can get a clearer sense of how Husserl's phenomenological project reconciles the apodictic aims and assertions across the whole history of science with that of our limited prejudicial first-person perspective. And applying the notion of historicity to the whole field of science will be the key to unlocking how it is we can come to embody that scientific spirit, to cultivate rational empathy out of absolute truth. In Husserl's system, historicity refers to any given group or culture's general historical trajectory. In the same manner that individuals take on styles and personalities as they grow and develop, so do communities, cultures, and states. Members of different groups share a common home world, so to speak. Narratives, references, landmarks, familiarities, habits, and a sense of what is foreign to the collective we. This common backdrop sediments over time into a cultural identity marked by shared norms and values that is further reinforced as it spiritually flows through the actions and motivations of those who identify with it. Husserl lists multiple phases of development that typically determine a culture's historicity. Cultures tend to begin with a shared belief in primitive animism, whereby nature appears as a living being whose countenance hides spiritual entities from what first meets the eye. Animating our surroundings are the ghosts of those who have moved on, spirits and nature gods. The world is alive, and the mysteries of those animations are to be respected, even revered, as they determine our fate. This primordial attitude towards the world is practical in nature, as the deferential way in which members of the community interact with the spirits of nature, and the way in which they understand themselves in relation to the world writ large, is a prime motivating priority for the group. The next phase in the development of a given culture's historicity comes with the emergence of the theoretical attitude, a contemplative attitude that takes on a more distanced, even disinterested stance towards the world around us. In Husserl's theoretical attitude, we step back from our complete absorption in the affective sphere of our habituated values and the practical sphere marking our typical way of interacting with our surroundings, and we reflect upon our beliefs and identity as we carry out our way of life. The theoretical attitude allows us to reflect on our motivations for believing and behaving as we do, as it recognizes in its reflections that things could be apprehended and lived through in various other ways. According to Husserl, the theoretical attitude brings about a higher ordered self-awareness wherein our freedom to shape ourselves and our world is realized. And with that higher ordered awareness comes a responsibility to prioritize the truth, a shared overarching narrative about reality, over our self-interest so that our reflections have a corrective impact on our natural way of being and evaluating the world. We want to generate, that is, concepts that can help in our self-edification. The theoretical attitude paves the way for a new way of life, the theoretical life, which Husserl attributes to the Greek philosophers. The theoretical attitude not only brings about higher ordered self-awareness, but according to Husserl, it ushers in higher ordered fields of inquiry and stricter approaches to establishing the objective truth meant to guide our theoretical pursuits beyond our self-interest, of course. Though the theoretical attitude is taken to be a collective realization within a phase of historicity for a given group, generating shared values based upon reflective concepts that are entangled with primordial direct experiences of the world, it is an attitude that individuals take on for themselves. And given that individuals are absorbed in their own life world of immediate sense apprehension, memory, expectations, and personally interpreted cultural norms and values inherited from their cultural traditions, a truth beyond personal prejudice is something contentious and hard to achieve. We each experience the world as a matter of fact and find ourselves engaged in a correlative association with the theoretical attitude that could use the world's self-evidence to reinforce pernicious prejudice over the nature of reality instead of overcoming them in a state of free thought. And our original processes of reason, especially when alienated from countering narratives, can embolden irrational passions that seek to dominate the personal realities of those around us, or which might possibly fold under the weight of an overwhelming relativism. Science as a collective effort, according to Husserl, arises out of the need to rigorously establish shared conceptual values that reflect the motivations and personal revelations of the members of a given group in such a way that represents an absolute standard of operating beyond the individual visions of truth held by the group overall. And that standard is that of our ultimate perdurance. By idealizing reality and the structures by which we come to know that reality, science develops models and methods for determining the adequacy or reasonableness of our free thoughts and actions without succumbing to strife and which allow us to see through our quibbles, keeping the greater life priorities binding us together at the forefront of our theoretical, axiological, and practical endeavors. Husserl sees the spirit of scientific pursuits as inextricably tied to the aims of establishing harmony, both conceptual and lived harmony, out of the conflict of conscious reflection with the world as we directly apprehend it, and out of the conflict created in communion with those around us. He sees this scientific spirit alive in the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, whose reflective methods of inquiry and conceptual models of reality serve to enlighten practitioners and inspire a life of intellectual wonderment and self-determination. And in terms of European culture, Husserl identifies the emergence of the theoretical attitude and subsequent development of science in the ancient Greeks as the beginning of the second phase of its own historicity. In his Crisis of the European Sciences, Husserl traces the cultural trajectory of European culture from the Greeks to his current time, noting major collective developments in the Western intellectual frameworks and practices since, and examining how those developments and practices became sedimented and habituated through the individual cognitive acts of its members. Here we get a sense of how it is Husserl believes higher ordered reflective concepts interact with direct perceptions to shape our experiences, our apprehension of evidence, our conclusions, and how different regions of our rationality come together to create cohesive identities and layered dimensions of reality, whether scientifically concocted or otherwise. Central to this process are Husserl's conceptions of intentionality, the transcendental ego, which is responsible for changes in attitude, changes out of the natural attitude into the theoretical, in which we can harness in our phenomenological attitude, we'll get to that, and also horizons of meaning. According to Husserl, our consciousness is marked by an intentionality or a directedness towards some objectively given thing available to our perception. This constant directedness allows us to make sense of the objects we experience, the world through which we experience them, and our rational nature, which constitutes the possibility for things to appear objectively as they do. As an object perdures in phase after phase of temporal givenness, we get to see that object from different angles. Though an object appears to us differently in each successive moment, there is something about that object that remains the same. Husserl calls that sameness an object's essence. And as we experience that object again and again and again, the structures of intentional consciousness reactivate memories of that object, which then shape our direct experience and set our expectations for further experiences with that object, whatever that object may be. It could be anything. While operating in the natural attitude, that is, while directly and actively attending to life and its matters, these essences develop spontaneously and passively in our perception, which in turn motivate our direct apprehensions from the background. Such processes constitute an empirical sense of the world and an empirical experiencing ego. We get a sense of the world's evolution as well as our own personal evolution. This empirical ego is the ego which, higher ordered reflective concepts develop from those essences. So Husserl wants to make clear that essences are not the same thing as concepts. It is upon the backs of essences that higher ordered concepts grow. So higher ordered reflective concepts develop from those essences, while the transcendental ego, that is the ego which is fixed, and remains fixed as the empirical ego evolves and develops its style, freely engages the theoretical attitude. So the transcendental ego is responsible for this switch in attitude from the natural attitude to a theoretical attitude where we are disinterestedly reflecting on the world. And as we reflect, we build these concepts, and those concepts can sort of take on a life of their own and are co-given eventually alongside those essences as they develop. So we are generating these concepts that also come to bear on our direct apprehensions and active evaluations whenever we return to the natural attitude. So co-given alongside our direct apprehensions are these essences that have generated from our experiences of the world and the concepts generated from our reflections upon those essences. When our successive perceptions align with our expectations, that is, whenever our expectations are fulfilled, an object behaves as we think it will, an outcome of an event happens as we believe it should, and a horizon of sense develops, and a life world of immediate concerns for the individual unfolds. As those concepts are verified through logical proofs and experimental fulfillment within a collective, they then become sedimented in the public sphere as shared values, which also in turn come to bear on our individual direct apprehensions. So it is through these means of both collective and individual cognitive processes that the European scientific culture develops. And that scientific culture comes to bear, again, on our direct apprehensions and on the personal evaluations we make and the meaning or sense that we generate for ourselves freely about life and how we're going to navigate through it. So while examining the developments of European scientific culture, Husserl notices an aberration that leads to a crisis in his time. But this crisis can also be seen as an opportunity to advance to the next phase in Europe's historicity by implementing Husserl's phenomenological method, of course. He identifies the aberration with what he calls Galileo's mathematization of nature, whereby our conception of reality is confined by mathematical ideal limits that obscure the full rational operations of consciousness and which keep science from fulfilling itself through our spiritual acts. The science that is naturalized after Galileo's mathematization of nature, in fact, denies the subjective contributions that frame the world as something which we can master through mathematical formulas and practices. The world under this mathematization is reduced to mere facts as facts of matter, and our consciousness as mere receptacles for those facts. And the world of mere facts of matter over which humanity holds dominion that results from this aberration and determines our judgment must be overcome if science is going to speak to the greater needs of humanity, which a science of mere facts of matter just does not have the power to attend. We must unlock reality's full potential and reflect on the needs of humanity on the whole and reestablish a truth beyond fact, beyond circumstance that unites our pursuits and which can act as an impetus for us to, well, get our acts together and act as reasonable, calm, cool, collected beings who have a common goal in mind, and that is the perdurance of humanity. So we want science to serve that. In this next phase of historicity, Husserl envisions a science that holds on to each phase of its development, so we don't want to deny the history that includes this mathematicization of nature, this aberration. We want to turn that that blemish into a positive step in our story. So he wants to include the logic of the ancient Greeks and their scientific practices all the way to our current scientific age. By harnessing the power of the transcendental ego to actively change our attitude to a radically philosophical, phenomenological attitude, we are able to keep track of all of the historical developments motivating our current comprehension. The intentional structures constituting the possibility of objective value in the first place, and the very acts of consciousness by which we might freely create new values about the nature of our world and reality, all at once, by turning our attention to the structures of conscious experience, connecting those dimensions together. We return from the phenomenological attitude to the natural attitude, according to Husserl, or when we do, we impress upon our understanding fresh insights and possibilities. And when we collectively make phenomenology a practice, Husserl believes that we can methodically construct the possibility for a living historicity, a living historical spirit, whereby we truly embody the spirit of science, honor the tradition as it's handed down to us, and open up new avenues for scientific exploration. And by doing so, we are really just opening ourselves up to allow the transcendental ego to push us into self-overcoming. So that's a rough outline of Husserl's notion of historicity. To open up the floor for questions. Thank you, thank you. Or comments, questions, comments, revelations, any sort of whatever's popping into your head, y'all. That's pertinent, at least.
What is the goal for Husserl, do you think, of history as like a study? Like historiography, or is that what he calls it? Is that what he calls like the academic study of history? Is it historiography for him?
Yeah, he does not want history to succumb to any sort of relativism, any sort of historicism, and he doesn't want history to fall into some sort of anthropological study. He wants the practice of history to be phenomenological, to trace the spirit of the transcendental ego as it influences the ebb, the flow of history itself. But he in a contradictory way does not want to assume some sort of end to history, that there is some determined outcome for the flow of this history. He wants to distinguish the way that the transcendental absolute ego influences the flow of history from that of Dilthey or Hegel's absolute spirit. But for practicing oh my gosh, I can't, historians, that's the word. For practicing historians, he wants history to be able to account for the origins of its evaluative measures. He doesn't want a history that relies on mere fact. We don't want to look at just historical artifacts and say, aha, from these artifacts, I can inductively create a narrative that can place us in the mindset of those historical places. The history is gone, and we cannot um, or the events of history are past, and we cannot reactivate them as they happened. And it's not as if historians aren't aware of this problem of history, of telling the narrative of history in an accurate way, in a faithful way. But Husserl wants history to not be relativized, to not merely focus on some sort of historical anthropology, but to recognize the activity of the transcendental ego, its input in the flow of time and of history and directedness, and to recognize that we can become trapped by the standards of history in the same way that we can become trapped by the standards of science. So if we're going to treat the study of history as a science, we cannot dogmatically cling to any narrative, any tradition. We must constantly question into the motivations for interpreting history as we do. Recognize that we are viewing the whole of our history or any epoch of history from our particular perspective, but also to recognize that because of the transcendental ego, we are able to establish some sort of common truths for humanity that speak to everybody. The structures of conscious experience, of intentional conscious experience, don't change. And Husserl is assuming that the ancient Greeks, their conscious structures are the same as ours. And because of that, we are able to empathetically learn from the past, to see ourselves, or at least to see our own concerns reflected in the concerns of past folks.
Yeah, that was one thing, was just that Husserl seems to be like one of a number of people who basically just think that you can't occupy the mindset or the perspective of people in the past just simply because you are always rooted and grounded in your own. And so, yeah, you can kind of imagine, but what you're doing is just pretending what it would be like from your position. And so your position is always there, and you're never able to like get beyond it in order to establish, in order to root yourself the way the historical person was rooted in their historical moment. I think Husserl, I think Sartre and Beauvoir basically agree with that. There seems to be a sort of but then those seems to think that, like, well, it was in your comments about, like, you're alluding to Hegel and things, that almost like history can fall under a concept, like the zeitgeist, spirit of the age, or the essence, I guess. We could talk about a kind of historical essence, the way that Husserl uses that term. But I'm not sure what to like think about that. Like, can you just let me know how that strikes you, or does that sound like Husserl to you, or no? I'm being crazy.
No, I was struggling with this as I wrote this little presentation. Is that Husserl is making a lot of assumptions about the way that history unfolds, and these assumptions can be traced back to conversations with Dilthey and notions of history that are common to Husserl's time. So he's assuming a lot about the way that history unfolds. His conception of history is built upon a concept that we can question, and which we can become trapped by, and it's kind of a leap to say that, oh, conscious experience is the same for everyone, even these ancient Greeks. While on the one hand, we cannot put ourselves in the Greeks' shoes, and we cannot experience the events that unfolded for the Greeks as they did, but we can be sure that they experienced things in the same intentional way. Well, how? That's not available. It's not available to us. And I also wonder about the potential for a determinism in Husserl that he wants to deny. We through the theoretical attitude and through science, we can change the course of history. We can determine for ourselves how we're going to act and to maybe occasion different outcomes. However, the nature of this transcendental ego is a little unclear. It's absolute. It is temporalizing, but itself is not subject to the changes of time. And if the phenomenological method is really just a way of opening ourselves up to be influenced by that transcendental ego, are we really choosing to undergo this phenomenological method? If historicity, according to Husserl, is sort of like this, comes in phases, and these phases have a pattern, like he's going to say, all cultures tend to start in this animism, and then all cultures tend to have this theoretical enlightenment, and then science emerges. Well, first off, you're coming from a European attitude where science is the norm, and maybe not all cultures develop in that order. If we're going to think of historicity as a mere trajectory within time of any culture, then how can you say that historicity follows these certain patterns? And if these certain patterns are motivated by the transcendental ego, which wants to overcome itself, or at least wants to motivate empirical reality or the empirical ego to overcome itself, it just seems as if the transcendental ego is in control of the flow of history more so than Husserl acknowledges. I don't know if that answered your question. I felt a little rambly there.
Well, I mean, just only because once you start, like, history expresses a concept or I don't know what you would want to say. That's kind of more Hegelian type language than Husserl, but not exactly either. But you're starting to like toe the line with the kind of subjectivism. But you're also, I mean, history relates to human beings and human activity, and it is kind of a story and a narrative. So it does have that element of, it's hard to break away from it. I mean, maybe I'm preemptively thinking about Paul Ricoeur too, is because he's so interested in the problem of history and the relationship between subject and the shared world and intersubjectivity and stuff. But
Husserl, I think, responds in a sort of way that is kind of Nietzschean, in that in our psyche we take with us our history. We keep that lizard brain with us, and so when we read books from history, even though it's a sort of one-way relationship, we can't speak with these dead authors, but the content about which they write is alive for us, and we can engage in a sort of living history by acknowledging that the content they're writing about is also present for us. So there is they're at least indicating a sort of shared evidence. Now we can't verify that, and that's what makes this relationship one way, and that's where Husserl does run into some problems, into some circularity, or into maybe some sort of determinism or subjectivism. Husserl would claim that he doesn't, but we're as you said, we're towing some lines here, and maybe this is a good opportunity to move on to our next presentations, because criticisms of Husserl abound in these notions of historicity. So if there are no other questions about Husserl specifically, we can go ahead and move on.
All right. I'm gonna share my screen. Wait. You see it, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, wait. Oh. So I'm gonna talk about historicity in Heidegger, particularly in Being and Time, because that's what I could focus on. In Being and Time, for Heidegger, historicity refers both to a point of departure of the phenomenological reflection. So he talks about how phenomenological reflection is situated, and in that sense, it is historical, right? And how it is embedded in the history in which it is situated. So it's a point of departure for the methodology of Being and Time, but it's also a theme within the analysis of existence that Heidegger is attempting to develop in Being and Time. For Heidegger, his reflection on the being of Dasein, or human being, we could say, is a reflection that it's embedded in historicity. So for Heidegger, philosophical thought is always embedded in this historicity, even if it's not explicit, right? But also for Heidegger, historicity is, let's say, like a condition of possibility for the existence of Dasein, right? Briefly, for Heidegger, our mode of being human is not defined by an essence, but rather by existence, right? So it's how our being is fundamentally unsettled and open-ended, right? It's not defined by an essence, but by the by our openness, right? How we are unsettled and we are not fixed as humans. And for Heidegger, this unsettledness of our existence is let's not say given, but it's grounded in the temporality of our being. So because our existence is grounded in temporality, this is why we are unsettled. This is why we are opened, both to a past that has shaped the possibilities in which we are embedded, and to our future in which we have to project ourselves. Yes. So for Heidegger, we're always thrown into a presence that is opened by the future and the past. And he refers to this as three processes, let's say, which are projection, thrownness, and falling. So projection referred to how we foresee possibilities for the future, maybe not in an explicit way, but how we project ourselves into that future. How we are thrown into a situation, into a context in which we are with others, but also how we fall into the present. And for him, this means that we are embedded in a kind of public interpretation of being. So how there is this in our everydayness, we exist in an understanding of being that has been shaped but by what he calls the day, right? This public mode of interpreting being. So as I had already said, it is temporality what lies at the core of the unsettledness of our existence, of this openness. And because of this reason, for Heidegger, temporality is the ground of our historicity, right? The openness that temporality gives to the sign's existence is the condition of possibility for historicity, and in this sense is also the condition of possibility for historiography, for history. So this openness that is given by temporality is what allows the sign to be its past, but also to be able to create a discourse about that past, as I had already said, which is history. Heidegger says, I put the quote there in the slide, this is in the paragraph 6 of Being and Time. He says, the science being finds its meaning in temporality, but temporality is also the condition which makes historicality possible as a temporal kind of being which the sign itself possesses, regardless of whether or how the sign is an entity in time. Historicality, which I think is better referred as historicity here, as a determinate character, is prior to what is called history. I close quote. Yes, sorry. So this is sort of the way in which Heidegger is thinking about temporality in connection to historicity, and for Heidegger, this means that we we are born into a context that has been shaped intersubjectively by our history, and this sort of shapes the possibilities that we can retrieve for the future, right? And for Heidegger, historicity can be lived in both an authentic or an inauthentic way. So now we're moving on a little bit to what Heidegger thinks is an authentic way of living, which for him in Being and Time is a kind of normative way of thinking what freedom for design could be. And for Heidegger, this notion of freedom is linked to an authentic existence. So for Heidegger, in Being and Time, the notion of authenticity is related to how we can own this unsettledness and open-endedness of our existence, right? How we can own that and appropriate that rather than hide that. For Heidegger, when we live inauthentically, we have sort of taken for granted the public interpretation of being as something that is fixed and something that we are just embedded in, and not something that it's actually open for us to appropriate and project different possibilities for the future, right? So for Heidegger, an inauthentic kind of existence and temporalizing prioritizes the present, prioritizes just the everyday of being concerned with things without sort of questioning how that everydayness can be opened up and perhaps unsettled, and how this present way of doing things in our everyday is not fixed, but rather it can be opened. So for Heidegger, this authentic existence emerges when we own this temporal openness of our situation. So it's not the revealing of an inner truth, but rather this, the way in which we can bring to ourselves a questioning of our own being, right? And a questioning that precisely opens up and shows to us that we exist rather than just that we exist and we are not just things, right? We are existing. Yes. So for Heidegger, this authentic mode of existence is not only linked to the future, to the creation of possibilities for the future, which for him is sort of this openness of the future and openness of this unsettledness of our being is revealed when we face up the possibility of our death, right? When we face up the possibility of the ending of all our possibilities is the moment in which we can realize that our existence is not given, but rather opened, and that we can project ourselves into a different mode of being. But for Heidegger, it's not only this being towards death that reveals the possibility of an authentic existence, but also authentic living is connected to the way in which we relate ourselves to our past. So authenticity is connected to how we bring the past to ourselves. So for Heidegger, our existence sort of stretches along two moments. The moment in which we are born in a context that has been shaped by history and by social relations, and the moment of death. And for Heidegger, sort of understanding how our existence stretches along these two moments, but it's also opened up. Understanding that is what allows us to understand how Dasein existence, how Dasein exists precisely, right? How it's opened. So according to Heidegger, this stretching between birth and death along the past and the end of our futurity, which is our finitude, is what shapes our historicity. And in this sense, the way in which Dasein is its past can occur both in an authentic or an inauthentic way, as I already said. So I can't simply take as given and fix the possibilities that the past has sort of carved in my present and the projection that those possibilities allow for the future, or I can creatively appropriate the possibilities that the past has given me and that have been opened by that past in order to live authentically. These would be two very different ways of bringing the past to our present. And they would be two very different ways of the past becoming significant to us. So authentically owning our own historicity means that we bring the past in our present in a way that matters and opens up to our own unsettledness. And Heidegger calls this authentic historicizing or historicity a retrieving of the past. We can appropriate that past as a field in which we can project our own possibilities for the future in a creative way. But for Heidegger, this is not a matter of an individual way of inhabiting the past, but is rather a collective an intersubjective way of relating with the past, right? Because he had said in Being and Time that another fundamental point of our existence is that we are with others. We exist intersubjectively. So for him, this relating to the past is not just individual, but collective. And he says in the paragraph, in the paragraph 74 of Being and Time, I'm gonna read this quote. I open the quote. So, but if faithful design as being in the world exists essentially as being with others, its historicizing is a co-historicizing and is determinative for it as destiny. This is how we designate the historicizing of the community, of a people. Destiny is not something that puts itself together out of individual fates, any more than being with one another can be conceived as the occurring together of several subjects. Our fates have already been guided in advance, in our being with one another in the same world and in our resoluteness for definite possibilities. Only in communicating and in struggling does the power of destiny become free. Dasign's faithful destiny in and with its generation goes to make up the full authentic historicizing of Dasein. Sorry, I got lost. Okay, yes. So for Heidegger, Dasein possesses a heritage on which it must act, right? So this collective way of inhabiting the past is expressed by Heidegger through the notion of heritage. Historicity means retrieving that past in order to actualize important elements of that collective past that can open possibilities for the future. So historicity is the way in which we, or in which a community can authentically respond to that collective past for the sake of the future, right? Yes, so authentic existence is related to the retake, appropriation, and recreation of heritage or tradition. So it's not simply, for Heidegger, historicity is how I can own in a collective way the situation in which I am thrown and own the possibilities that situation is giving me. Yes. So I am authentically free in this historicity when I recognize that I'm a finite being that has a shared past and I can creatively with others appropriate it, right? This doesn't sound that bad, right? However, Heidegger makes a lot of mentions throughout this chapter of Being and Time, chapter 5, about how this retrieving of authentic historicity needs both the figure of heroes and the figure of a leader. And this point of Heidegger's philosophy in Being and Time has been connected to his politics, to the way in which he supported the Nazi regime and the way in which this connection is not just accidental, but it's actually rooted in his philosophy. And this is something that, for example, Levinas is going to criticize very sharply, claiming that Heidegger is sort of hiding certain violence behind the appearance of a neutral ontology. So he is actually committed to certain politics and certain ethics, but sort of doesn't show that explicitly by saying that his point of departure is a kind of neutral, or like giving account of human existence in general as such, right? So in this sense, for example, Levinas has shown how Heidegger's analysis is actually complicit with violence in many ways. And maybe I'll talk a bit of this more with Fanon, but that's what I had. I hope I was not that unclear because I prepared in a rush, so sorry.
I did too. That's okay. Oh, that was great. Yay!
So if you have questions, I hope I can answer.
I'll just throw in that I don't know how you read that and know anything about Heidegger and his politics and don't see kind of clearly the line as to the fatefulness of the people and its destiny and all that stuff is. I mean, it becomes really explicit in the early 40s and like the truth lecture where he's like, I know he was being observed by, but he didn't have to quite go that far in. Even, you know, that's beyond appeasement what he says in the about the fateful reckoning of the people as it steps into its historical place in history and all that. I mean, and it clearly is coming out of what he says is in line with what he says in Being in Time in those moments.
Yeah.
So yeah, to me it's very clear. But
yeah, but for me too. But I found many commentators, like from the things I read, that said like, oh, like till here is fine, but when he start talking about a leader and these things, then no, like then it's like another thing. But we can read his philosophy like in separating this, and for me this is not a good reading of this, because you can clearly see. And I can see, like, also in the notion of authenticity itself, like already problematic things, I guess. So yeah, I agree with you totally.
I just feel it's foolish to ignore it because it doesn't give you a very accurate picture of Heidegger. But also Heidegger's talking about something that people like really pine for. I mean, like it makes, I think it does us good to pay attention to things that Heidegger says here because it's something that grabs the human like psyche so violently, and that people like fight for and about, like this feeling of rootedness and belonging to a place. So the existential thing that he's addressing, I think, is nothing to be dismissed or shaken off, even if I think like the ontology that Heidegger is like laying out behind that is not true, I guess, for lack of a better word. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think even more like in the current political climate, it's very important to read these things in a very critical way. And sort of reading them in context, right? Like and not separating, like, because even it's unfaithful to the way in which phenomenology claims that thought has to be situated, right? So if we separate Heidegger's philosophy from his own historicity, it's problematic in itself.
I mean, Heidegger himself seems to argue that you can't do that. So even if you take the word of the father so seriously, like it counts against your interpretation.
Exactly.
To separate it. Now I know that there's a lot of like, well, there's a lot of work to be done and so on and so forth, and I've heard all that. I'm not sure, as someone who still studies Heidegger, and I find it very worthwhile to do so. You know, I like Heidegger philosophically in a way, like But yeah, I don't want to let in fascism. So
Well, as a Husserl person, I was very intrigued by this sort of primordial need that you mentioned, Donovan, and that you referenced, Angela, this need to belong, and its relationship to a sense of fate. Like there's a comfort to fate. Like, oh well, my life is just up to fate, so I guess I don't have to do anything about it. And and if our sciences, to put it in Husserl's terms, are just merely matter of fact, and we are fated to just be here in a meaningless sphere with no means of making meaning for ourselves, sets a situation that is ripe for tyranny and fascism to take hold. So I wonder about that lizard brain and how it is we carry our history with us. Whether Husserl captured that notion correctly or adequately, I'm not so sure, but I do think that need that you mentioned is strong, and it might be a motivating factor in how it is we can sort of fall back into these, I don't know, comfortable dogmas, and I don't know, the phenomenological exercise can be so painful and take us out of our comfort zone. Um, ah,
it's also kind of funny, and how I'm curious as to what people think about this. So maybe Heidegger, late Heidegger, I wonder, because the way that the fate and the destiny gets bound up with the they and traditions and things, it also seems like a kind of an easy out sometimes that would, according to a later Heidegger, terminate thought. And because it becomes like a kind of cultural technology that can just be applied to the problems of your existence, like, well, I just do what they say, I grow up and go to college and get married and do whatever, but that is not a thoughtful life. That's just going through the kinds of things. So I could see a kind of like late Heideggerian critique of this kind of stuff, and I wonder if I'm seeing things, or if it's part of Heidegger's like disillusionment with this type of thinking and this type of politics, frankly, that he like loses the faith a little bit as he like does the whole turn. And I'm talking too about more later, like after the fourfold stuff, Heidegger. So I don't know how that strikes everybody. Or even setting the Heidegger stuff aside, that like some of this stuff could offer like a kind of shortcut or a schematic to like, well, I just do that then. And that seems to go against like the ethics of thoughtfulness in Heideggerian philosophy, if not in Heidegger himself.
Yeah, I guess that the question would be then like how it is that we collectively interpret that past, right? Because then, I mean, he's not saying like just the destiny is given and then we just have to live the everyday. That's precisely what he's saying. Like, this is not authentic living.
Right.
But then I guess what becomes problematic is like, how can you collectively retrieve that destiny? And if it's under the figure of these heroes or these leaders, then it's very problematic, right? So I guess that the question would be, and I think he doesn't give an answer to this, at least in here, how this process of retrieving the past occurs in the collective way, not just individually, because you would think like just reflecting, right? But then sometimes he says in this chapter that I read for this, that this retrieving of the past can happen even if you do not produce historiography, for example, or even if you do not explicitly have or produce knowledge about the past. You know what I mean? Like this authentic way of retrieving the past can happen even outside of history as knowledge. So it's like, yeah, I don't know. But then with your question, I was thinking about the problem of language and thought for him later, and how language and thought are unable to sort of capture being or
well, the kind of non-historiographical stuff I always would assume would be things like ritual, like Christmas morning, where you're, again, maybe I'm getting too far into the Ricoeur, but you're repeating, so you're reinscribing, like through the repetition of the act, like the historical record, extra record, or outside the record as it's written out in historiography, but it's still the basis on which the historiography was written. When we say the ritual practices of the English in 1950, whatever, like, you know, that, and I think Gadamer it really picks up on that and drives it with the stuff on tradition, that it has to be constantly like reinterpreted and picked back up and made present, or it becomes like a dead kind of thing. I think Gadamer just takes that further and develops it more than Heidegger does, but it's there. I mean, I think Heidegger's talking about these kinds of things, and again, like just like folksy, folkish things there.
I'd like to read for those who will be watching at home. We've got a comment from Victoria. She wants to say, absolutely, in response to Donovan there, that seems to be the conclusion of the book At the Existentialist Cafe that it offers as well. At that point in his life, he had lost many of his friends, consistently denied holding fascist viewpoints. He seemed to sort of play an on-the-fence position, idling between the two until his death. So
I'm very, very curious, and I have said in print that I'm curious about these, like the late Black Notebooks, and what on earth he was thinking privately or saying privately. I don't even really think that there'll be some sort of like absolution or anything. Like, I don't think he's like, oh yes, and fascism was totally wrong or anything like that. But I'm just, what was it? Just to know what on earth he was thinking at all. After all of that, I'm very curious. Almost in a non-scholarly sense, if I'm being perfectly honest with everyone. Yeah. Just,
you mean the Black Notebooks, like
in like the late ones, like once we get through into like the 50s and the 60s, because right now I don't have access. I only have access to ones that go up into the 40s, and the ones that are in the war years and in the mid 40s are bleak. I mean, it's depressing. I couldn't imagine sitting and just reading through them, because he's so angry. I mean, and understandably so. His country's in ruins. You know, the government that he put all his faith in has collapsed and led to this international tragedy and committed all kinds of atrocities. That his sons are in prisoner of war camps. His marriage is rocky. At a point in time, he has to stay. He has to stay in a like a castle or at an estate with a couple, where he has had an affair with the wife of the couple, and he's like writing to his wife about like the uncomfortable. And she's basically like, well, you should have thought about that, Martin. You know, because they had kind of a quasi open relationship, Martin and his wife, Heidegger and his wife Elfriede. Anyway, it's just like, so yeah, he's just filled with such like, it's just such anger and like just, you know, despondency about the situation. It's bleak. Anyway,
I haven't read them, but it's in my reading list.
Save that for February when it's dark and gross. All right. Are there any more questions or comments on Heidegger? his notion of historicity. All right. Well, let's move on. Let's move on to Sartre Beauvoir, and then we'll flip to Ricoeur and then get back on our chronological track.
We won't go too far off chronologically. I'm going to talk about existentialism kind of broadly, but really focused on Sartre and Beauvoir. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that they share in common and then how they diverge, especially as they grow and develop, and their views on what we should focus on in terms of history and what matters for historical struggle, particularly, to diverge. Me lay, like, what are the stakes here? I think that the death of God really is central to understanding, especially Sartre's view on why history is important, because history presents itself, and we're seeing that, I think, with this Heidegger discussion, exactly. History presents itself as like a really good substitute for God. And when people start casting around for like the source of value and meaning in things, history kind of keeps rearing its head as a candidate. So Sartre and Beauvoir don't want to, they want to develop a secular philosophy. They want to develop, a philosophy of freedom and so on and so forth. They're worried about ways that theological notions and non-secular notions can like creep in the back door. And so they'll be critical of Marxism and fascism, actually, both on the way that it treats history. Sartre and Beauvoir both argue with the Marxists of their day, less with Marx and more with Marxists in France, about the nature of history and the role that history plays in human freedom. So they don't, one of the things that they want to avoid, or one of the philosophical pitfalls that they want to avoid, is treating history like God, or like an alternative to God in some capacity, history with like a capital H. And I think that their criticisms of Heidegger fall along this line. One of their criticisms of Heidegger is that he's doing this kind of thing with history, or is risking doing this kind of thing with history. So that's one thing to keep in mind when we talk about historicity. The other thing that you always is that history is something we do for Sartre and I think Beauvoir both, in a very like robust sense of action. So there's a couple of different ways you can parse that. History is what we do. So we do history in terms of a study. We produce history and historical records and narratives and stories and all kinds of things. But also we're like making history all the time. We're historializing. I'm not sure if that's right, but we do things in history, and we have personal histories, and we're injecting ourselves into the historical action of other people and their histories and family histories. And there's all of these like, messy historical relations that we're entangled in, involved in, and nested into in different ways. You can think of my individual history inside my family unit, history inside the larger family, inside the whatever. So there's all kinds of different ways you can parse historical relationships. Now, what that risks, obviously, is the God problem. With under a robust enough description, historical description, determinism becomes a problem, or we start to think, wow, if I just describe the historical circumstances enough, I would just get a complete picture. I would just get the total picture, and that would be it. And there would be no more room for freedom. I think that Sartre is a little bit flippant about this in Being in Time, and I don't know that he always like fully appreciates the weight of the problem. And I think Beauvoir and Merleau-Ponty like make Sartre take this more seriously, because I think he has a kind of like, yes, but the past is the past. And of course, when you look at it with hindsight, the past takes on the appearance of an object. It's what has happened, and it seems from the position of the present to be determined in a necessary way. But that's not how it is, really. That's like a trick that our position in time plays on us by allowing a past to become solidified basically into an object, by collapsing possibility into actuality. And then this XYZ happened, and it happened with an apparent like necessity and objectivity, like nothing else could have been the case, or something like that. Now that's all pretty good. Like, I think Sartre is not like he's not on like bad philosophical grounds there. I don't think he's going to be, his argument falls over with a breeze or anything like that, but there is still something dismissive about all the ways we're enmeshed in the situation that Sartre cops to, that we are thrown into a situation that we did not choose, that history was performed before us by people who are not us, that set up all kinds of conditions that we have to reckon with and reconcile ourselves to and struggle against and try to change and whatever. So this is maybe one point of departure between Beauvoir and Sartre, is that I just think Beauvoir takes more seriously than Sartre and makes it a more central part of her philosophy, the idea of the situation, for one, and the struggle that the subject feels and experiences existentially, having been thrown into this system, this intricate web of different relations, historical and otherwise. So in addition to the idea of like writing history and studying history, historiography, there's also an important concept of ontological historicity, like the fact that we have a history that we didn't choose and that appears to us like an objective object and so on. Now, again, they don't want to set that up into a God thing. And so history is always going to be related to a deeper, let me clarify what I mean by deeper. Structurally deeper, something that's on like an ontologically more fundamental level, let's say, than history. Because history is going to involve people, that's going to involve beings who can be historical, who can have a historical consciousness, who can remember things, and that's really important for Paul Ricoeur. But it's something that we're doing, and that's a result of our actions. And that's happening because we are temporal, that we are beings who are in time, or we are temporalizing beings, or there's a time structure to us. And historicity is sort of piggybacking onto the fundamental ontology of time and temporality not as an epiphenomenon. It's not just popping off of there as a meaningless byproduct, or as an ineffectual or non-causal byproduct, but it's happening in virtue of our existence in time. History is like blossoming out of time, because history is encompassing not just the past. And this is where Sartre in particular is going to try to break the determinism argument, because history, there's almost like a historical field that's sort of moving along through time, that includes things that have happened in the past, but those things in the past are giving structure and meaning to what's going on in the present. The present is rationalized, and reasons for why things are the way they are given by appeal to these past facts, and so on and so forth. And they're also opening up different possibilities. And here is, I think, the real sort of saving grace, is that none of those historical setups, none of those conditions, or any given fact of history means that the future has to be one thing and only one thing. They all open up into a variety of different possibilities. I don't know that it really matters. I mean, I think you can say things like a seemingly infinite number or something like that. More, I've talked about this in a couple of different places, and I'll point you to them in just one second. But it seems like it would be too many possibilities to meaningfully like account for or deal with, even if we had some sort of supercomputer or whatever the case may be. It's theoretically impossible, I think, according to existentialism, to somehow calculate or manage or handle all of these possibilities in some sort of like meaningful way. So we're paring them down and trying to select between them, and that's one of the functions of our freedom that's guided by our interests, and so on. So history is not determinative in that sense. It's open, and it looks necessary and determined only by virtue of hindsight because of where we're positioned in time. Now, politically, this has a lot of different, I think existentialism attempts to give a systematic view, and history and historicity are really functioning at the levels of ontology, how the world is, and epistemology, like how we know about the world. And those two things are always related to each other in existentialism. It doesn't make sense, I don't think from the position of someone like Sartre or Beauvoir, I don't think it makes sense to separate metaphysics and epistemology into two discrete things. They're very much Kantian, and I think that way, and they're just, those two things are very intimately entwined. And so they're looking at historicity on an ontological and on an epistemological level, and showing how the ontological structure of time is giving rise in these beings who are conscious of their temporal existence to a thing called history as we historicize throughout our existence and so on. And that's a play thing. It's spontaneous. It has to do with contingency. There's one element of necessity to this, is that there has to be some contingency. I tried to explain this before in the Being and Nothingness seminar, and I never feel like I always feel like I'm saying something that I understand, but when it comes out of my mouth, it sounds like gobbledygook. But it's it's just the idea that history is contingent. The facts of history are accidental. I guess we can conceive of it as other things happening or something like that. But what is necessary about history is that it has some contingency. So the specific things are not themselves individually necessary. It's just necessary that there be something that fills in the content of history. So it's the necessity of contingency. Some contingency is necessary, but what the actual specific content of the contingency is are not themselves necessary. Does that make sense? I think I've got it where I can explain it okay now, but every time I say it, I'm like, that sounds crazy. I don't think I'm right, maybe. But people tell me, okay, no. Yeah, so some kind of contingency has to be in place for history to be happening, and it just has to have some content. Whatever content it is, whatever the specifics, those are accidental. That's good for us because we can change, we can struggle against these contingent facts, we can attempt to alter them, and that's how we assert our will. They reject this notion of authenticity as Heidegger formulates it, because they don't allow for the kind of historical gift of a heritage that Heidegger has in mind. I don't think. People might disagree with me about this, but I just think that for Sartre, and I think really Beauvoir, once, especially the kind of cultural and social analysis you see in like the Second Sex, Beauvoir and Sartre seem to be sketching out a kind of more intimate and fine-grained personal negotiation with the past and history. Like, this is why Beauvoir is so hard on mothers in the Second Sex, because mothers are made responsible for child rearing. And so her reasoning is somewhat straightforward. If we have a sexist society, then people have to be raised and trained to be sexist. But if that's weird, because mothers do the child rearing, and so it must be mothers who are playing some big role in rearing children to be sexist or whatever. But why would they do that? Because it's against their interests as women. Why would you raise a kid to like resent you, right? So like, and now of course she's got all kinds of answers and all kinds of different, but it has to do with this like intensely personal negotiation between the individual and these larger historical circumstances where you are saying yes and no to different things as you like onboard it. So that it seems like there's less of a kind of wholesale adoption of like a cultural heritage or something like that, and more of like you keep coming across these moments where you have to make decisions, and the context of those decisions is this cultural heritage, we can call it, but you're never presented with it in the whole. You're not making some decision about whether or not you're going to become a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or whatever the heck it is. You're making these little like point, and though along the way there's negotiations, and Beauvoir is really good at picking this out. Those negotiations are excluding you or including you into the heritage, or into the heritage that's claimed by people with the social standing of the one. And now this is Beauvoir's analysis, right? This is really not in Sartre, and this is how Beauvoir takes up the notion of the other. In Heidegger, the other is first and foremost the people that you don't really differentiate yourself from. And in Beauvoir, that's very different. The Beauvoir, the other exists in a relationship with the one. And the one is the person who's taken seriously and whose agency is respected and who can actualize their will in the world without much resistance and so on. But the other is the one whose value in society is defined by their relationship with someone who can occupy the position of the one. So support roles are allowed to the other. And these are often defined in, wife, mother as support roles. And we can still see this in, debates today. I think you could do a Beauvoirian argument that in the abortion debate, it's clear that the woman takes up the role of the other because her interest is subverted even to an unborn fetus or someone who's not yet a fully human. So she has to support it, therefore she occupies this role of the other. And even a developed person is afforded more consideration than the one there. I'm not, Beauvoir was a pretty robust supporter of abortion, right? So I don't think I'm making some wild extrapolation from her position. So on the one hand, there is a tension in existentialism, and it's the fundamental tension that exists, I think, throughout existentialism as a doctrine, insofar as Sartre in particular, but Sartre and Beauvoir between them kind of work out a more or less coherent system. I think it's just one of the central problems of they need the setting for the individual. They need history as the scene of individual development, of action, of freedom to be situated so that it can be free and do free acts, that whatever. But they also need that person to be free in that situation. They need to free it from history. So they need history for freedom to function, for it to have something to grasp onto and make contact with the world so that it can act. But it also can't be determined by it. It has to be freed from history also, so that it also can turn around and become a historical actor and make history itself through its actions, and participate in historical, kind of world historical events, by joining a political party or a church or whatever the case might be. Sartre really goes into the Marx direction after existentialism, you know, uh, is brought to the world during the fall of 1945, I guess. And history, I think, for Sartre still is housed in terms of the class struggle. He's a materialist, I think, and an ontological monist. So he thinks that history is, what is history? Well, at the end of the day, it's the human account of the unfolding of the material conditions in history and so on and so forth. So I think that Sartre becomes maybe more committed and more invested in the idea of class struggle and the materialist analysis of that class struggle. And the Critique of Dialectical Reason attests to that. I think the way that he analyzes Flaubert and The Family Idiot, the long, multi-volume work on Flaubert at the end, backs up what I'm saying and is a kind of not, I don't think it's reducible to a Marxist analysis, but I think it does that whole historical through the material record and the material evidence and that kind of thing, and the class politics of Flaubert. Beauvoir, she was very committed, in The Second Sex, her answers to a lot of the problems are sort of socialist answers. She talks about adapting socialism. And The Independent Woman is a lot about bodily autonomy, yes, but also financial independence in an age when women couldn't open bank accounts and so on and so forth. I think Beauvoir develops a more nuanced take on that and expands beyond, well, I don't really think, you just see the way her relationship to feminism changes, and she gets tired of playing the other to the class analysis, basically, that her interests as these other identity markers that she holds, as her interests as a woman, aren't being addressed by those politics, or as whatever it may be. So I don't know that Beauvoir herself abandons some of these core Marxist positions, but I think she certainly expands the scope of her political project and starts looking for ways that I think to build sort of like bridges of solidarity from like the worker and the labor's movement that was the scene of socialist politics in the 20th century, up until that point, and to start trying to like connect that to the women's movement, particularly in women's lib. And the anti-colonial, the workers' movement and the focus on class struggle wasn't always catching the colonial stuff that had a race element to it. And Beauvoir, with Fanon's help and the help of other correspondents in the United States, they just become better equipped to deal with that. And that just expands them beyond their existentialist framework and also the sort of Marxist socialist analysis that they had adopted in the war years. So I'll stop on that note. Existentialism.
I appreciate that you broaden my appreciation for Sartre every time we talk about him, especially with this notion of historicity. I do get kind of mad at Husserl. Normally, I'm pretty adept at speaking on his behalf, but there are just some troubling notions about historicity as something that happens in phases, and which is an expression of the transcendental ego overcoming itself. Husserl does include these material concerns and his concept of the noema, any sort of object given for us will include our personal history with it in its presentation, and then the collective history in its presentation as well. But to have these constraints about the processes of history really bother me. So I wonder about Sartre's sort of turn. I like that he starts off with historicity as just, well, I'm thrown into this historical situation and it's necessary for my freedom or to occasion free acts. But then he has this sort of class struggle narrative at the end. How would you reconcile those two periods of thought?
Yeah, so he's not an orthodox Marxist in the sense that I don't think Sartre believes in like, well, Sartre's not going to argue for like a progress with a historical P that could unfold independent of human actions or anything like that, because like history is really just a big whoopsie, and it can go forward in terms of progress and it can go backwards and sideways and and there's no promise of like the arc of history bending toward justice unless we make it, and how we make it is the matter of political debate and strategy, because it's not guaranteed. And if you want to see this a certain kind of world actualized, then you're going to have to like figure out a way to work toward it and take collective action to work toward it. So yeah, that is part of the really like, I think the other element is pragmatism. I dropped a link here to a piece I wrote about the influence of American pragmatism on Sartre particularly, but through Henri Bergson, who translated William James's pragmatism into French, and Bergson was a huge they pick up on a few little things that James is saying about how truth functions and truth works, and there you can see Sartre's materialism on display, particularly in, I think it was written in the 40s, 44, 46 maybe. It was published posthumously and translated as Truth and Existence. But Sartre just talks about how truth has a historical course. Truth is something that humans discover. It's the result of human practices and dialogue with one another. Yes, anybody could have discovered the phonograph, and this is an example that William James gives, but in fact, Thomas Edison did discover it, and that's just the course of truth in history. And it's all building on each other, and we're all participating in it and taking fits and starts and so on and so forth. But truth as it exists is exactly manifest in like this specific historical course that it took through the material stuff of existence, and that's something they draw on. Well, you can read there some of the textual evidence to see where it comes from. Pragmatist inspiration, pragmatism, and Hegel, which Hegel inspired pragmatism, so it's all
I'm sharing it now to the Facebook thing.
Back and forth and back and forth. Yeah. They say that yeah, that's all.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Any more questions about Beauvoir or Sartre here, folks? Or shall we move on to Ricoeur?
I just have one.
Okay.
I was thinking when you were talking about the later emphasis on how history is contingent and how is made by collective human action, and there is no telos that it points toward. And then I was thinking how that relates to the notion of freedom here, because when you were talking, freedom seems to be something very individual, very rooted in rational reflection, and yeah, perhaps I don't know if conscience is the word, but yeah, yes. So I was wondering how these two relate, or if there are different approaches to freedom, or I don't know. Yeah,
this is my favorite thing. That's my favorite question. So I would say that let me just. This is one of the things that I think early Beauvoir, especially in the 40s, like is she likes to let Sartre do this work, and then she'll cite it so that she can talk about ethics. And she's like, well, as Sartre says, blah blah blah, and then Sartre's all like, oh yeah, let me find out all the like, let me work out all the fine-grained metaphysical problems of freedom. So I would say that the order is reversed, that consciousness is rooted in freedom, and that's what makes freedom radical for Sartre, is that it is at the root, or that around which all of the human things. So the consciousness emerges from freedom. Now, how that happens is that's the Hegelian mystery and the kind of esotericism of existentialism. I think, like, there's some event, some rupture in being, and that's freedom. And in that, the consciousness can emerge. So I would say that that consciousness and rationality are rooted in freedom, and that you can have rationality, and so they reverse the Kantian order, or they want to, whether that's successful. But whereas, well, I don't know though for Kant. That's a good question. Let me set that aside. Let me put that aside. Whether or not, which one would be ontologically prior in Kant? I would want to say reason, but I'm not sure that I could. I'm not confident that I could defend that now that I'm really thinking about it. But for Sartre, anyway, I know that it's freedom. I know that it's freedom here. So I also then wonder that history itself is freedom. Then would be the condition of the possibility for history, because history only emerges through action, and freedom is the ground of all act. And so history is a byproduct of freedom. It's like the self-reflected understanding of human action as ours, or something like that. But then that's still different than historicity, which is still, again, built on like the real material conditions that you live in, right? But I don't think existentialism wants us to conflate those two things. There's something like raw about the material conditions that we live in, and there's something about historicity means those objects have already been interpreted as having a certain historical value. Yeah. But I stand by basically my answer that history, under the ontology that is spelled out, I think that history emerges out of freedom. Freedom would be the ground of historicity, I think.
Cool. I know with Kant, the capacity to reason is free from the start, but it's like a little germ, a little mustard seed that we must actualize, and our lived condition is definitely not free from the start. But I think it's in a way co-given.
Yeah.
But that's an aside.
But it's just that Kant places the emphasis on reason as enabling freedom by giving you the rule.
Right. And because reason itself is free from the laws of time and space, it is itself temporalizing.
I know,
It provides that space.
Kant wants to have his cake and eat it too.
He does.
He just wants all of the things to be happening all together at once and call it the schematism. Yeah. And wipe his hands of it.
Yeah. And here we are. Yeah. Thank you, Kant.
Yeah, all of these, and I think just to, I guess, set up Paul Ricoeur a little bit, right now there's a hot post-Kantian philosophy is a big subject area in professional philosophy. And I think, you know, all of the people that we've been talking about can be related back to Kant, because as I tried to be clear with the existentialism stuff, time is really, you know, history is tied to our existence as time, as temporal things. And Ricoeur is a philosopher of time in an important way. And his view of history is tied to his understanding of time and of our existence as temporal. So he is, I think Paul Ricoeur is among a generation of people who have theological commitments, who are super struck by the kind of arguments that I just outlined from atheists like Sartre, and who are mounting a kind of post-existential response to, you know, to it. Because Ricoeur's early work is on some of the existentialists, particularly like Gabriel Marcel, and his minor thesis was the first translation of Husserl's Ideas 1 into French in the 1950s. So phenomenology is there for Ricoeur. The existentialists have already, that was the booming philosophy of his sort of young days. And then he publishes two big books in 1960, I think it is, Fallible Man and the Symbolism of Evil. And in the subsequent years, Derrida comes along and works under Ricoeur while Derrida's a student. So Ricoeur is right there at this like pivotal moment in French philosophy. You know, he's translated Husserl, important Husserl text for the first time, studied the philosophy of the existentialists, taken that all sort of under his belt, Levinas, that sort of thing. And then he's helping now to train and influence Derrida and that next, you know, Foucault group. Hermeneutics is, yeah, that's Ricoeur is a name is synonymous with contemporary hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the philosophy and theory of interpretation. Biblical, most people, maybe if they've encountered the word hermeneutics, is biblical hermeneutics, the interpretation of the Bible and other related texts and materials. But there's a philosophical hermeneutics that became, you know, popular and important during the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th century. So when it comes to history and historicity, Ricoeur, more than the existentialist, is concerned with the study of history, and history as a scholarly topic, because history is written and it needs interpreted. So Ricoeur is concerned with the interpretive problems of history and historicity. So if he's falling more on the epistemology side, how we know about historical things, how we account for them, how we justify our historical accounts. And this follows along a general trajectory of Ricoeur's work, which is really dealing with the epistemological issue and the epistemological crisis of what he calls the human sciences, the humanities, or it's a category that Ricoeur uses and that is much more common in Europe and in France, that it includes the humanities like English, but it also includes like sociology, the study of anything like human sciences, so study of knowledge about humans. So it's a little more, it's just cut up a little differently than what academia in the United States is. It includes some of the sciences like psychology and sociology, some of the qualitative or the soft sciences, and it includes like the study of literature and political science and that kind of thing. So kind of the reason why Ricoeur is interested in those is because they're self-reflective sciences. Other sciences are directed outward at the world toward externalities, but the human sciences, as Ricoeur calls them, are directed back at us. And so they have particular methodological and epistemological problems, big problems of self-reflection. And these are hermeneutical problems because they're problems of interpretation, both how we interpret evidence that presented, events, and how we interpret the methodological question of how to go about interpreting. So there, a whole mess of hermeneutic issues. Ricoeur, when it comes to history, like the existentialist, is a skeptical. Ricoeur is somewhat famous or infamous for his involvement with the hermeneutics of suspicion, which I have been variously questioned, castigated. I've had people get like mad at me for the hermeneutics of suspicion, like I did that. And I'm like, I'm just trying to explain it, And they're like getting really heated about it. And I'm like, dude, I don't know. I'm just trying to explain something that like some French guy said. But Ricoeur knows that historical accounts and all of these human accounts are motivated. He's very tuned into the problems of biases and prejudice. Hermeneutics generally is interested in the study of human prejudice, and they often will talk about it actually in one level back in abstraction. So, for instance, Gadamer will talk about prejudice just literally in its very literal reading, prejudicial, just prejudgment. Things and biases, so they do include prejudices like racism and sexism and so on, but they are just stuff that you haven't thought critically about and yet hold an opinion on or a view on or something like that. Something that you think but it hasn't really come about. You haven't earned it through critical, like, sort of reflection in a way. And so when we approach historical documents and texts, we always have to be very sensitive about the guiding question that we're asking them and how we're approaching them. And this is why people don't like it, because it seems like it throws up like a host of all these caveats that you have to be careful of how you're situated and how your biases and then how the people who wrote it may have been impacted and so there's all of these like sort of caveats. But I think that's actually beyond Ricoeur. I don't think that's really there in Ricoeur. I think that's stuff that gets read into and built upon what Ricoeur is saying, which is that history as a study is uniquely reliant on memory. How do I want to parse it out? Let's just say memory, both in its individual and collective senses. And then, of course, forgetting on the other side of that, which is the title of his last major book, I think, Memory, History, Forgetting. And history is sandwiched in between the three concepts. So it serves as the fulcrum of the sort of movement from memory to forgetting. Now, the reason why that is, in very simple terms, and not including any of like the many pages of argumentation that are in memory, history, and forgetting, is that history is established through the negotiation of memory and forgetting, because you have to retain certain things and forget others. And that is one of the things that makes history politically suspect or suspect at all, because whose memory and who's forgetting and why and so forth, and what's motivating it at all. Now, Ricoeur himself earlier on is not as interested in the justice and ethical issues. He's interested in the ethics sort of throughout, but the notion of justice and the concern with justice grows with Ricoeur. And toward the end of his career, he's writing like exclusively about the just and those themes. But when he's writing early in his career and he's thinking about history, it's a little bit more about the individual it's a little bit more focused on the problem of like individual subjectivity and infallibility, and how that relates to a collective. And it's almost like he has a one type of trajectory that you see amongst French thinkers, which is that early work dealing with individual issues, dealing with issues of human freedom. If they're theological or religious, you'll see freedom will always like be in there, but also like the problem of evil, which you see in Ricoeur with the symbolism of evil. And then Ricoeur's Gifford lectures, which are oneself as another, you start to see a kind of shifting into more explicit concerns with justice that are built upon their earlier ethical work. And then a shift from the level of individual analysis onto the level of like a collective analysis. So the one self as another is still working on the individual, on identity, and how I have an identity in the way that another has an identity, oneself as another. And then memory, history, and forgetting is more about like these kinds of collective memorializations. So it's moving us between those levels of analysis, between the individual and more dealing with the collective, which is what history is really like trying to get us at. It's trying to get us at something shared, at something that is built out of perhaps individual and experiences and individual memories, but that's something that we all can like touch somehow. The reason why this gets fed, why this feeds into issues of justice and all of that, is because there are just moments of historical reckoning where the where what is going to get remembered and what's going to get forgotten and how it's going to get remembered are debated and sussed out. And there are times, of course, when this comes about more poignantly and more explicitly and are more debated, but it's always sort of going on like in the background as we chug along. So again, for Ricoeur, this is a subject of interest to him because it's concerned with our interpretation of the world and with our self-interpretation. And if we're going to have something, we're not going to have, I don't think, something like an objective historiography that gives an account of the facts as they were. You might get something like an account of the facts as they were, but you're always, again, we're getting back to the same idea that we've circled around. You're not going to be getting them from the same position as the people who lived there. And if you're a couple generations out from even the same position of the next generation or whatever, and so on and so forth. So you're always going to be reaching back through your own position to it. But you're going to get a kind of history that matters. Because it's going to be animated by questions grounded in where you are. So I think that's another theme. That's another kind of hermeneutic theme, I think, that is repeated throughout, right? So you're going to have a history that's meaningful to you, and one that's still living, one that's in the process of repetition and reinstantiation, but repetition always adapted into the present. Don't want to go off onto a Deleuze type of tangent, but it's a kind of repetition with a difference, because it has to be repeated with an element of the same, but it can't be fully repeated because it's temporal as the same qua strict identity. It has to be, it has to undergo or suffer that temporal adaptation in order to be received into the present as significant then and there. There's a weird thing that goes on where, you know, stuff that comes in from the past, if it was really received only with the meaning that it had in its past moment, it would be meaningless now, or it wouldn't be fully comprehensible now. It has to have enough connection to like bridge a little bit, you know, because it has to be able to speak to us, which means in a kind of contemporary vernacular, right? And there is a kind of, I don't want to call it conservatism outright, but there is that conservative regard for the classics and for certain traditional works of art or rituals, or I mean, Ricoeur is he was one of the only Protestant faculties in the French system at the time. He was among, not just he as an individual, but the faculty at the school he was at, now I forget where it was Protestant. So he's religious, you know, he has a connection to some of these religious traditions and things. And so that kind of respect for the past is important to Ricoeur. And so you can see, like, there's that kind of awe and wonder at the past and its ability to speak to us. Like, Homer still speaks to us after 2,000 years because of, you know. And again, that is Ricoeur's concerns are never going to drift too far away from this written record thing because of his connection to philosophizing about interpretation explicitly. And so again, he is going to be less prone to wander into like the austere ontological heights, because he's really wanting to track history as a practice, historiography. And in fact, in Memory, History, and Forgetting, I think he says he'll let the historians have the last words over the philosophers. Marked it here. Oh yeah, and he's saying it as somewhat as a rejoinder. So he says that he'll let the historians have a last word, and that his thesis is that the historian is not left speechless by the radical manner of entering into the entire problematic as history. The radical problematic is what Heidegger said. It's this. So Heidegger has not only placed the main emphasis on the future, in contrast to the retrospective orientation of history and memory, he also places this futureness under the sign of being toward death, submitting in this way the indefinite time of nature and of history to the harsh law of mortal finiteness. My thesis here is that the historian is not left speechless by this radical manner of entering into the entire problematic of temporality. So this historian can still enter into like the existential and ontological level according to Ricoeur. They're not sort of like stopped by that radical subversion of because again, you have to kind of read between the lines here with Ricoeur. Think to our conversation just now about Heidegger, historicity, and fate. And then here thinking of being towards death. So everything has to be oriented toward a sort of finality, like a fate or destiny. Ricoeur seems to be concerned that Heidegger is leaving us with a kind of historical fatalism, if we're not careful, that a strain of Heideggerian thought is leading in that direction. And he's allowing historians the last word so that they can so that we can see history as something alive and not oriented toward death, as something that's, the past is an important part of our renewal now in the present. And so it's not a dead thing or oriented always toward death. It is that by which we rejuvenate ourselves. We take, we're nourished by the past, at the best times. And again, that's facilitated through memory and forgetting, because you're not going to get either like the total picture of history. You're not going to be able to have the total collection of all the facts. Stuff's gonna be forgotten. Just, it has to be. Back to Husserl and adumbration, you know. Stuff has to get left out, and that's, you know, you don't have a sensible narrative without things being forgotten. There's deep problems with forgetting because it's something that we have some ability to control. We can forget on purpose. We can choose to let things go, to forgive and forget, and you know what I mean? Like, there's a politics to forgetting. It's not always just an accident or a natural process, but it's an essential part of of establishing history, of historicalizing, or through time. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that you mentioned sort of this infinity at the end. That's something that connects to Husserl, not only through adumbrations, but at each step of Husserl's conception of historicity. We have this interplay of the infinite, that life goes on after death in that first stage where we have this sort of primordial animism where folks are still around. Then we have the sort of infinite play that the theoretical attitude allows us to go back and forth between, you know, our factual world and how it is, you know, we might conceptualize it. And then we have an infinite possible realm of ways that things could be that we could open up in our third phase. I'm wondering about ways that we can differentiate between Ricoeur and Husserl, and I've possibly this conception you mentioned of memorializations might be a good, you know, breaking off point. I'm wondering, are Ricoeur's collective memorializations something restricted to the written record, or can it be like statues, or can it be institutions? How does he preserve like a home for this history?
It's hard. Yeah. So I think Ricoeur generally takes the text in a pretty broad sense, so we don't have to restrict he often does, but you don't have to restrict yourself, I don't think, to books. But it has to carry like some sort of propositional, it has to make a stand or a statement. He wouldn't exactly talk about it in terms of propositional content or anything, but it has to carry meaning. You know, it has to be able to sort of stand, or you have to be able to position yourself vis-a-vis the thing. Statues, I think, and those sorts of public memorials are definitely, I think, without any real question, open game. I think the fuzzy areas start to come about in like institutional practices and things like that, because, well, hermeneutics of suspicion. You know, sometimes we're asked to do things and it's supposed to be in honor of something, and is it really about that, or is it someone other interest coming in and they got that opportunity to enact a policy that they wanted to, and so they did, and it's in memory of, but is it really about that? No, it's about some other things. You know, I mean, like it can get complicated and messy, but I think there are definitely times where it can become explicit, and that's why they're politicized, because it is there's I think it's a book. I want to point you to an essay in this book about the conflict of interpretation, but the book is called The Conflict of Interpretation. And politics is very often about conflicts of interpretation, conflicts about the meaning of an event and how to respond to it and what desirable outcomes would be, and so on and so forth. But these are all tied back to sort of how we're interpreting and understanding the world, both in the way that it is and what that means for the future, and so on and so forth. So but history has an important role in structuring and maintaining hope, because you have to think, okay, so he's warned a little bit against fatalism. We know he's got some religious, so there is a sense in which Ricoeur believes in that type of fate, right? Like, doesn't he believe in the second coming and that kind of stuff, right? I mean, even if it's a philosopher's way of believing in it, right? That's still but I think that is a kind of radical. I think Ricoeur wants to understand that future state of grace as a kind of like radical openness and possibility. So for him, it's not like, it's not an end. It's not even like a fate necessarily, because there's still like the freedom in God and everything for Ricoeur in terms of his theological understanding. So there's still this like what he views as an inviting and radical openness and possibility at the end of history, or whatever the case may be. I have a hard time sometimes articulating Ricoeur's thinking in that direction because I don't share it, and I have a hard time like living with that line of thought. But I'll do my best. It really comes up in his discussions of justice, right? Because one of the things that Ricoeur's worried that folks like Derrida are painting us into a corner where things like justice becomes impossible. You know, the gift is impossible. You know, the hospitality is impossible. And being generous to Derrida, we know that he doesn't mean impossible in some sort of straightforward sense where we're never kind to people and we're never hospitable, right? That's not exactly what he means, right? But I think Ricoeur is a little bit Ricoeur wants to live in a just world, and he doesn't want only. There's people demanding justice that Ricoeur's like thinks we should try to respond to, and how do I not put my cards all the way on the table? He doesn't want to accept a theoretical position that would preclude the achievement of justice in the world, even in the face of a greater justice yet to come in the kingdom of heaven or whatever. Now, I think that both Ricoeur and Derrida fall into esoteric academic disputes that don't have anything to do with realizing justice in the world, because they're arguing about abstractions. But I still think Ricoeur, as a philosopher and thinker, is worried about having the theory that will meet the demands of action.
So would he be skeptical of this notion of Husserl's that, it's through science and the methods of science that we will have salvation, that we can maintain this hope, that maybe by putting all our eggs in that science basket, we are limiting the ways that we can interpret justice or different avenues of being, and that maybe we might be memorializing science too rigorously. I don't know.
Yeah. Ricoeur is tough, because he doesn't fit in the camp of those nasty postmodernists that you can just, his work on science, and I guess in what you would call the philosophy. I mean, I don't think of Ricoeur as a philosopher of science, but if you read a book like Hermeneutics and the Human Sciences, he's concerned, like Husserl was at the end of his career in the Crisis of the European Sciences and so on, about the human sciences having a good foundation, a good philosophical foundation, and about being able to secure something like reliable knowledge. So I think that Ricoeur is invested in science as a project and wants it to succeed, and wants it to have good philosophical foundations and so on. But the whole any kind of techno utopianism or messianism is like no, because that is the problem. The problem with the human sciences is that they're not the hard sciences, and they can't be reduced to them. And so one of the hard problems that it has to be grappled with is that we can't just explain away or reduce away consciousness in that. We can't just say, well, it's just atoms and whatever, because there's still the fact that people are going to report, when it comes to the medical sciences, people still have to report their pain that they feel. And we have, and there's interpretation on at 2 points. There's the patient's self-interpretation of their pain. There's the patient's interpretation of what they're supposed to be reporting to you, what the scale of 1 to 10 means, and how they fit their pain onto that scale. And then there's a theory of pain that says it can be placed on a scale, that it can be interpreted such that it could be placed at a number 7 and a number 8, and then the doctor's understanding of what that means. And again, so you can see why he would call something the conflict of interpretations.
Yeah, and the hospital's policy to just deduce from the blood work without using common sense.
Yeah, and these exist together. These are not like cordoned off from one another. They rely on each other in some ways, like especially if we start to see how they like interface and because there are objective signs out there, and there's a number written on a chart that we can all see in some shared capacity. So sorry, Ricoeur doesn't like fit in neatly into this like postmodernist guy who like doesn't like science or thinks it's all, even despite all of his talk about conflicts of interpretation, he still thinks we have to try to work in some way. The problem though is trying to make it all flat and trying to like say that there's going to be sort of, because I think he agrees with Derrida that the text is not going to give us the master key to unlock it, that we're having to rely upon things to make judgment calls about our interpretations that aren't given to us within the text. I think he and Derrida more or less share that idea. That's why it's suspicious, right? Because I can't necessarily trust the text to be read at face value necessarily, right? So I have to develop some sort of like external critical capacity to bring to bear to any particular thing, which is again why the notion of history can be, and it will probably always be, a contentious one, but one that we can't avoid contending, because it's connected to our self-understanding and our sense of justice, and who's gotten their just deserts really is a question that is settled by appeal to history. And so we have to try to work out some way of like, establishing an acceptable historical record. Now, I don't know that Ricoeur himself has a great answer. I think he's a masterful masterful analysis of the problems. But again, you have to be careful declaring that you've got an answer to this type of a problem, because it has to be any answer has to be responsive to history and to develop, So that's another thing I think people have with this sort of generation of thinkers, is that they do a little bit of like, well, I'm not sure it's for me to say all the time when it comes to like, yep, but how does one do history, like actually? Oh, he's not without suggestions, but there is a sort of like, it depends type of attitude.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, well, let us turn to some Merleau-Ponty.
Okay, great. I'm gonna start my video. I made a little, hello. I made a little presentation for all of you, so I'm gonna share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to be talking about Merleau-Ponty's concept of historicity. As it's used in the phenomenological tradition, the word historicity refers to an aspect of my experience whereby I come to discover that both I and the phenomena which I grasp inhere within a world which bears the contours of a developmental trajectory in which my life is encompassed. Insofar as we find ourselves within a world which we experience as historical, as having a past and a future which span and transcend our living present, we can ask, what is it that, from within my living present, allows me to grasp the trajectory of my life as imbricated within the movement of collective history? What makes it possible for me to experience the world as historical? This line of questioning, which begins from our experience of the world and inquires into the prior conditions which must obtain in order for us to experience the world as we do, is transcendental. A phenomenologist might say that historicity is the transcendental ground of history. Historicity is what makes our experience of history possible. Let's flesh this out a little bit. If historicity refers to an aspect of my experience by means of which I come to understand that the world transcends my living present, then in order to talk about historicity, I need to talk about the related concepts of transcendence and the living present. A brief discussion of those aspects of historicity will lead me to examine Merleau-Ponty's notions of flesh and institution, which came to occupy increasingly central roles in his later thought as he attempted to combine existential phenomenology with the then emerging tradition of structuralism. Throughout the 1950s, Merleau-Ponty reformulated his earlier understandings of history and consciousness according to the logic of institution. In the 1940s, Merleau-Ponty had advanced an existential Marxism, which called for a faith in the proletariat's ability to concretely realize the progressive ends towards which history had appeared to strive. But by the mid-1950s, Merleau-Ponty's increasing disillusionment with the USSR led him to abandon Marxism for a philosophy of history which expressed the circular logic of institution. Understood as institution, history moves in a perpetual circle, advancing into the future by attempting to return to its origin, and historicity is the means by which we grasp this circular movement from within our own living present, providing us with an experience of what Hegel called the absolute, a continual self-propelling movement beyond the given towards what, in the present moment, transcends givenness. Merleau-Ponty's engagement with the concept of institution also motivated him to reformulate his understanding of consciousness. His earlier works had grounded reflective consciousness in the pre-reflective and pre-subjective perceptual consciousness instantiated by the passive syntheses of one's own perceiving body. But as Merleau-Ponty became increasingly concerned with the impossibility of reflectively grasping perception in the act of perceiving, he came to believe that the notion of perceptual consciousness was a contradiction in terms. Instead, Merleau-Ponty came to understand perception as the unconscious ground of reflection, a ground which constitutes an abyss for thought, an unplumbable depth which the natural light of the mind can never fully illuminate. Insofar as reflection inherits its capacities from a perceptual field which precedes and exceeds its grasp, it never achieves the self-transparency at which it aims. And insofar as the perceptual field only comes to be thematically expressed through an act of self-reflection, which necessarily remains incomplete, perception too remains opaque to itself. By the end of the 1950s, Merleau-Ponty had vowed to do away with the word consciousness altogether. Instead, he proposed that embodied perception, now understood as flesh, constitutes a, quote, originary institution at the level of, quote, wild being, understood as perceptual phenomena in the process of transcending themselves into ideal expressions. As wild being sediments itself into ideal concepts through our expressive engagement with perceptual phenomena, it gives birth to the secondary institutions of culture, language, and reason, which then return to the perceptual field from which they emerged in order to draw further inspiration for their future. The intentionality of flesh as it seeks to express itself traces an endless circuit between perception and reflection, unconsciousness and consciousness, and nature and culture. Historicity involves grasping this infinite circle as the, quote, flesh of history itself, a process which is both always already underway and never able to be completed. Okay, so I have three interrelated theses. First, as I've just explained, Merleau-Ponty's concept of historicity consists of these three interrelated concepts: transcendence, the living present, and institution. Second, understanding the interrelation of these concepts will allow us to understand Merleau-Ponty's later philosophy of history according to the logic of institution. As institution, history moves in a perpetual circle. It advances into the future by attempting to return to the past in order to recapture the originary spark of meaning which motivated its original project. Every attempt to return to its origin fails, but the failure to recover its origin reveals history to be a perpetual movement or self-transcendence without an origin. Likewise, the ideal ends towards which history appears to strive inevitably remain on the horizon of our living present, receding as we approach them. But our failure to realize them, once again, reveals history to be a perpetual movement without end. History just is this infinite project which is always attempting to realize its ends by returning to its origins without ever being able to do so. And my last thesis is that historicity expresses the means by which we grasp the perpetual movement of history from within the flesh of the living present. Sense originates in the depths of the living present, as my personal life intertwines with natural and cultural tempos which span and transcend my own existence, even as, unbeknownst to me, they secretly animate my life from within. I think that this notion of historicity as a perpetual movement towards a horizon which always eludes being brought into full presence is best captured by a word which appears everywhere in Merleau-Ponty's texts, and that word is sens. It's a French word that means simultaneously sensation, meaning, and direction. If we understand the way in which these three aspects of sens are intertwined, if we understand that sensation or sense perception is already meaningful before the intervention of consciousness, and sensation is always moving towards its expression in the form of ideal concepts, and those ideal concepts are themselves moving back towards the sensory field from which they emerged, then I think we have understood the central thrust of Merleau-Ponty's entire philosophy. Sens is always in genesis, in the midst of an infinite and circular process of becoming through self-interpretation. In order to grasp the genesis of sense from within our living present, all we have to do is look. So let's get to it, starting with transcendence. To say that phenomena transcend their appearance to me is to say that whenever I perceive any phenomenon, I have the sense that the phenomenon contains more than what I currently perceive of it. If we were to closely examine our experience as we live it, we would discover that phenomena are only ever partially present or partially given to us at any one moment. I always see things from a certain limited perspective, whether that perspective is spatial, emotional, or ideological. And although my perspective gives me a limited view of things, I am never entirely ensconced within it because I always grasp from within the perspective that I currently occupy several other perspectives which I could possibly take upon the phenomenon at another moment. My ability to transcend my current perspective corresponds with the transcendence of phenomena from their perspectival appearance to me. And both of these aspects of transcendence originate in what Merleau-Ponty called the depth of the world. Now, depth is a universal structure of my experience. To say that a phenomenon has depth is to say that from within the particular perspective that I have upon a phenomenon, I encounter the phenomenon as, in some sense, overflowing its perspectival appearance to me. I sense that there is more to the phenomenon than what I currently see of it. This allows me to recognize each momentary perspective that I have as a momentary perspective upon a single unitary phenomenon, which resists being fully present at any one moment by virtue of its withdrawal into depth. We could say that depth contains a promise of future presence by harboring within itself an array of possible perspectives which I could take upon the phenomenon. As I grasp these possibilities as possibilities without ever having to actually occupy any of them in any empirical sense. Depth weaves possibility or transcendence, or in ontological terms, negativity, into every present moment. Presence, then, is always a partial presence and a partial absence. But the absence which I perceive is only the indication of a further presence which is not immediately present because it lies latent, an invisible presence behind what is manifestly visible. Merleau-Ponty calls this depthual, latent, and invisible presence a, quote, present absence, or a, quote, absent presence. The partial presence and withdrawal of phenomena into the dimension of depth imbues each moment of my experience with a pervasive existential quality that Merleau-Ponty called ambiguity. To say that my experience is fundamentally ambiguous is to say that I never have a full grasp on things because I never encounter a world which is entirely present. And this is because my experience of the world always unfolds from a certain perspective within the world, which envelops and transcends each perspective. But by the same token, the thing's transcendence of my perspective, or its withdrawal into depth, weaves possibility into my present experience. But the possibilities which are offered to me in the thing's depth are always only the promise of further limited perspectives, which themselves refer me to other perspectives, and so on. I transcend my present perspective by moving from one interlocking perspective to another, but I never transcend perspective itself. Another way to say this is to say that I am always situated within the world. All of the possibilities which I grasp gear into each other because they are all situated within the horizon of the world. Rather than limiting my freedom, situation provides me with the only kind of freedom that I know, a freedom which emerges from my concrete and finite existence. Even when I am reflecting or grasping a seemingly eternal truth, I always do so from within a situation within the world. Even reflective consciousness is only a thematization of my perspectival view, which is all I am. Now, it should be clear from this brief discussion of transcendence that transcendence is intimately connected with temporality, or the passage of time. I've spoken of grasping possible perspectives for future engagement with phenomena from within our present perspective, and these are all explicitly temporal terms. So in order to deepen our understanding of transcendence, we'll need to consider that universal, existential, and depthual structure of temporality, which phenomenologists call the living present. As I engage with phenomena by shifting my perspective on them from one moment to the next, I retain a sense of continuity between the various perspectives that I pass through. As I move from one situated perspective to another, I don't have to begin my investigation over again at each new moment. Rather, my experience remains remarkably consistent with itself, even as the contents of my experience are constantly in flux. And this is because the general structure of my experience remains the same throughout each moment. Each moment retains a memory of the perspectives that I previously held and anticipates an array of possible perspectives which I might hold in the future. I experience these past, present, and future perspectives all together, simultaneously intertwined into a single block of duration, which Husserl called the living present. If we attend closely to our experience of time as we live it, we can observe the intertwining of past, present, and future together as it occurs through the passage of time. For example, in The Visible and the Invisible, Merleau-Ponty wrote of perceiving a red dress. For Merleau-Ponty, the dress was, quote, a punctuation in the field of red things, which includes the tiles of rooftops, the flags of gatekeepers and of the revolution, certain terrains near Ai or in Madagascar, the dresses of women, robes of professors, bishops, and advocate generals, end quote. For Merleau-Ponty, the red dress called forth an entire constellation of other red things which he had previously experienced. The dress fell into an existing framework of red phenomena that had accumulated in the depths of his being over time, as the red things he had encountered throughout his life piled on top of each other and sedimented into levels of red experiences, forming a, quote, vertical history akin to the vertical formation of geological strata. Merleau-Ponty brought this vertical framework to bear upon his perception of the dress in the living present. As he perceived the dress, he didn't merely remember the constellation of red things from his past. Rather, his sedimented experiences of red phenomena provided the interpretive framework which he used to perceive the dress itself. The red dress summoned up a field of past experiences because it was a variation in the field of red things themselves. Thus, it was neither entirely new nor entirely familiar to him. Rather, it was, quote, a certain node in the woof of the simultaneous and the successive, end quote. The entire weight of his past experience was brought to bear upon his present, not as a limit to his understanding, but as the only means by which he understood the dress at all. His past experiences carried him into his present. They constituted the ground that he stood on. Thus, he wrote, quote, A certain red is also a fossil drawn up from the depths of imaginary worlds, end quote. To say that the living present has depth is to say that the intertwining of past, present, and future that we discover there constitutes a temporal field which spans a certain distance, is bound by a certain horizon, and possesses a certain thickness which I reckon with. If I attempt to install myself within the present moment, here and now, I am always inevitably referred to a there and then, to an entire series of other interlocking moments that stretch into the past and the future, which themselves refer me to further interlocking moments that stretch farther into the past and future, and so on. Each moment of the living present is already intertwined with all of the other moments. Therefore, each particular moment is already universal. I grasp in each moment an experience of a, quote, quasi-eternity, or a, quote, existential eternity that, quote, works on the inside of time. The depths of my living present allow me to access moments of time which are far distant from my own. These moments show up in the present as the past or as the future. Thus, they are present, but, quote, present at a distance on the horizon of the living present, receding into latency and depth. Sedimentation provides our lived experience with a certain solidity, weight, or facticity, which we use to understand our world. But the living present is not only factical, it is also perpetually new, as time perpetually flows from one moment to the next. The passage of time imbues my living present with an element of spontaneity or contingency. The flow of time is both sedimented and spontaneous, quote, both ever new and always the same, end quote. As time flows, we continually fold new experiences into our existing schemas, and thus our sedimented interpretive frameworks are continuously updating themselves on the basis of our present experience. Sedimentation is an ongoing process. It is, as Hegel would say, the transformation of contingency into necessity. Insofar as I am always within the living present, my understanding is always contingent. It's always subject to further revision in the light of future experiences. But insofar as my present is borne by the entire weight of my past, it expresses something necessary or essential about my history and my way of life, my style of being in the world. All of our life unfolds through the dimension of the living present. I am a wholly temporal being. I can never step outside of time in order to observe its passage, like someone who stands on the banks of a river to watch the river flow past. Rather, I myself am the flowing river, quote, I myself am time, end quote. Even when I step back from my life to reflect upon it, I do so only through the thickness and depth of time's waters. My temporal existence presents a problem for any philosophy which would imagine consciousness to be capable of a complete and self-transparent reflection. Insofar as I am time, a time which perpetually flows, I never actually coincide with myself. I am spread out through the dimension of time. The most I can hope for is a coherence amongst my different moments. Like the living present, quote, I am never at one with myself, end quote. Between my active reflection and the entity which my reflection grasps, there's an unbridgeable gap that's instantiated by the passage of time. The flow of time produces an irreducible difference between myself as the one who reflects and myself as the one who is reflected upon. The same can be said of perception. There's a temporal disjunction between the act of perception and the phenomena which I perceive. For what I grasp through reflection or perception is thematized, but the act of perceiving or reflecting itself is unthematized. Moreover, the unthematized act of perception or reflection provides the ground from which all of my thematic experience springs. I am never able to thematize this unthematized ground, because doing so would require another act of perception or reflection, which would itself remain unthematized. Thus, I am unable to observe the originary moment through which the world comes to constitute itself in my experience. Whenever I attempt to install myself at the genesis of the world's constitution in order to observe the passive syntheses of time and action, I discover that the world has always already been synthesized, owing to the sedimented facticity of my past, and is also never completely synthesized, owing to the spontaneous and open contingency of my future. The passive syntheses of time, which give birth to each moment of my experience, originate in a sort of pre-time, which eludes my grasp. Merleau-Ponty called this pre-time a, quote, mythical time, or a, quote, time before time, quote, a sort of time of sleep, end quote, which constitutes, for my understanding, an absolute or, quote, original past, a past that has never been present. At the origin of consciousness, or so to speak, its ground, lies a depersonalized abyss whose depths I cannot plumb. I cannot thematize the origin of my experience. Following Schelling, Merleau-Ponty called the unthematized origin of experience, that process through which experience comes to be, the unconscious, and he located it in the sedimented and sedimenting interpretive schemas of our perceiving body as it intertwines with phenomena in the process of perception. Just as phenomena and the living present resist being fully present by withdrawing into depth, I too withdraw into depth. And in fact, the depths of things, the depth of time, and my own depths are all intertwined in the primordial depths from which they spring, the depth of flesh. Now, flesh is a tricky concept. Merleau-Ponty was still trying to figure it out at the time of his death, but perhaps its incompleteness doesn't pose a barrier to our understanding as much as it expresses something essential about its meaning. I think that expression is central to the concept of flesh. I think we can understand flesh as expression. I've highlighted three aspects of flesh as expression here. First, flesh indicates that expression is an act of being itself, rather than an act which originates in human consciousness alone. Flesh is, quote, an intentionality within being. Now, Merleau-Ponty clarified that he wasn't attributing sentience to rocks and trees. Being here is synonymous with perceived being or phenomena. Flesh is just the ontological exposition of the position that Merleau-Ponty had already developed by the early 1950s, quote, perception is unconscious. But flesh is more than just the unconscious ground of consciousness. It is also the transformation of perception into reflection as phenomena continue their attempt to intentionally grasp themselves through our flesh. The perceptual field transcends itself through its depths, giving birth to a vertical field of concepts or ideas which appears to be more solid and stable than the perceptual field from which it emerged. Perceptual phenomena attempt to install themselves in this emergent conceptual field by, quote, coherently deforming their tacit perceptual meanings through the process of expression. But once they are sedimented into an ideal form, phenomena discover that ideas are no more solid or stable than the field of perception is. They eventually return to the perceptual field in an attempt to rediscover their roots in the depths of the perceived world, and this process is endless. Phenomena are teleologically oriented towards achieving a completed self-expression, but the manifold expressive gestures which they call forth only testify to their inability to coincide with themselves. Flesh conveys the coherence of this endless process of self-deformation as phenomena move in a continual circle from one realm to another, seeking a stable self-identity and instead finding self-difference everywhere. The unity of flesh is found in its process, in its expressive non-coincidence with itself. The inability of expressions to coincide with what they express produces, quote, a coinciding from afar, a divergence, and something like a good error, end quote, which reveals flesh to be a self-transcending unity in difference. Understood as expression, flesh incarnates the metaphysical principle of the identity of identity and difference. Following Hegel, Merleau-Ponty identified flesh's endless quest for self-expression as the incarnation of the absolute. Expression is absolute because its inability to coincide with itself gives us a concrete experience of infinity, not as a concept which expression grasps, but as that which always exceeds the grasp of expression insofar as it withdraws into depth. The absolute is being's endless struggle to express its own depths. Understanding flesh as the endless quest for being's self-expression may seem to place us far from a philosophy of history, but as we're about to see, expression is the very, quote, flesh of history itself, if we understand it according to the logic of what Husserl called institution. Merleau-Ponty argued that flesh provides us with a, quote, originary institution that serves as the ground and blueprint for the secondary institutions of culture, language, and reason, which together constitute the essence of human history. Now, institution describes the process through which meaning comes to project itself into the future by establishing itself as an open sense that is to be realized. The establishment of meaning as a futural project binds, and in some sense draws the present towards itself by organizing within the present certain trajectories that we can take up and make our own as we attempt to realize the projected meaning in our present. To say that institution projects sense as open is to say that the fulfillment of the project which it promises is both contingent and also infinitely deferred. There's no guarantee that we'll realize the institution's originary aims. In fact, if anything, the opposite is guaranteed. We'll never realize the originary meanings that institution sets forth, because every attempt to realize them requires that we take up the meanings for ourselves through an expressive act, which transforms their originary meaning. Institution endows the passage of time with the dignity of a purpose, but only on the condition that the purpose remains unfulfilled. Institution exists as a project that is always still to be realized. Its future always remains open. There's always more work for us to do. Quote, expressing what exists is an endless task, end quote. Merleau-Ponty identified several levels of institutions. There's the institution of an experience, the institution of a work, the institution of language, and the institution of social structures. We've already encountered an example of the institution of an experience in Merleau-Ponty's perception of the red dress. Recall that Merleau-Ponty's perception of the dress unfolded through the field of red things, which had sedimented in the depths of his being. This field of red things was first established at the moment when Merleau-Ponty encountered his first red thing, presumably as an infant. Although that experience was, at the time he perceived the red dress, long forgotten, it set forth the experience of redness as an open trajectory to be filled out by other red things in his future. As he continued to grow and fold new experiences of redness into his sedimented field of red things, the field's structure continually transformed itself. Although each experience of redness throughout his life occurred as a contingent event, the field of red things which sedimented in him was not itself contingent. It constituted his understanding of the essence of redness itself. The essence of redness, like any other essence, is always in formation. Essence is a verb. It is the transformation of contingency into necessity by the establishment of a tradition which projects itself towards an unknown future on the basis of its past. Essence is an institution. As Merleau-Ponty perceived the red dress, he grasped its essence through the unique manner in which the dress wove itself into his sedimented field of red things. The experience of redness provides us with an example of a meaning which we will never stop developing for as long as we live. Redness has the cohesion of a life. But is the cohesion of a life sufficient to account for the institution of collective history? My everyday interactions with others offer me an intimation of some of their sedimented and sedimenting fields of meaning, but I don't appear to have access to others' experiences in the same way that they do. There's something unpresentable in my experience of others, which entails that their life as they live it will always retain an element of mystery for me. But the same could be said about my own life, for as we've just seen, I too secrete meanings whose depths I cannot plumb. My life already diverges and withdraws from itself through the depths of the world's flesh, and thus I am already other to myself. But just as I overlap and intertwine with myself through the flesh of the world, so too does my life overlap and intertwine with the lives of others, insofar as all of us are expressive variations of the field of being itself. Certainly, cultural acquisitions like art and language expand our sense of participating in collective history by presenting us with a repertoire of publicly available texts whose meaning can endure far beyond the originary intentions of their producers and which establish shared traditions around their projects. The reason that traditions endure throughout history is not because the meanings which they express are taken to be literally true, as if they achieved a perfect correspondence with an unchanging reality, but because, quote, they retain an expressive power which exceeds their statements and propositions, end quote. And in so doing, they reveal truth, history, and the world itself to be poetry, that is, a creative expression, the meaning of which will never stop developing. True historicity, or what Merleau-Ponty called living historicity, grasps the world as an ongoing project that is always still to be completed, and it grasps ourselves through the depths of the flesh of the world as the inheritors of this infinite task. For we ourselves are the world's expressive flesh, in divergence from itself and return to itself, in unity and indifference, both always new and ever the same. quote, "We are moments of the open field, which is syngenesis, sense in Genesis, emerging once and for all." Thank you.
Yay, and thank you, thank you. I'll just go ahead. I'm excited. I'm gonna ask a question. So with the ambiguity of the flesh and of this unconscious, does sedimentation help us distinguish between the fantasy expressing itself through the flesh versus historical trends and institutions expressing itself through the flesh? How are we able to distinguish, I guess, between different strata or dimensions or elements coming together in that ambiguity?
Yeah, that's a great question, because they both refer to the past, but fantasy seems to refer to like an intrapsychic past, or like the past of an individual, whereas if we look at, say, a painting or a fossil in a museum, it refers to something which appears to exist outside of myself. Yeah, I think like this, there is an ambiguity of inside and outside, or myself and otherness, already at play in the way that Merleau-Ponty understands history and the self and just existence generally. I'm not sure that he has like a completely developed theory which would account for the way to differentiate between like reverie or fantasy and yeah, the kind of experience that we have of gazing at like, a 5,000-year-old cultural artifact. But there is, in both of those experiences, what unites them together is like a sense of something which transcends my present experience, which I did not constitute actively.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you. Oh, yay, Spore, Shell says, yay, yes.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right, any further questions, comments, reactions?
I was wondering if you maybe could say a little bit more about the human, non-human distinction in relation to the flesh and historicity, because in many parts of the visible and invisible, Merleau-Ponty seems to suggest that the notion of the flesh would unsettle this dichotomy. So I don't know, what do you think about it?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating topic. The way that I want to answer this by giving some context. The way that I read the visible and the invisible is in the context of his courses on nature, and the final courses which he was giving at the time that he was writing his working notes for the visible and the invisible, were really concerned with like tracing the emergence of like humanity from like natural evolution. Like, how did we emerge from as a species from like this, our non-human animal past. And in the visible and the invisible, he argues that flesh is like a non-anthropocentric or non-human, it's an inhuman concept. And he says that it's what prevents phenomenology from being anthropology. So flesh appears to be something more than human. It's inhuman, it's also in us. It is like our ground. It's the non-human ground of our humanity. And I think he identifies humanity with like our ability to self-reflect, our ability to use language, although he says that perception itself is already a kind of proto-language. But yeah, it's I don't know, it's a fascinating concept because it presents like us humans as kind of containing within us at our core or at our essence, like this non-human being, which he says gives us access to empathy with all sorts of everything in the world, non-human animals, inanimate objects. Yeah. I'm not sure that that provided much of an answer. But.
We have a question from Shell. Does Merleau-Ponty believe sense, red, is perceived without language or category? Like, does an infant perceive red without knowing red label to differentiate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's throughout the 1950s, Merleau-Ponty was in dialogue with Lacan, Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, about this very question. For Lacan, like consciousness or subjectivity is always linguistic, right? We perceive the world through language. Merleau-Ponty thinks that there's some kind of meaning which exists before language and which grounds language, and that meaning is given to us by the field of perception itself. So he argued that language emerges from the perceptual field, but the perceptual field itself is pre-linguistic or non-linguistic. However, he likens it to language, and it's very similar. The structure of the perceptual field, it has a diacritical structure, which is very similar to his understanding of Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure's understanding of language, which is as a system of signs, which are all composed of differences from each other. When he says that the perceptual field is basically the same thing. There's no signs, but there's moments or sectors of the perceptual field, which are all differences from each other, and all of sectors of the field refer to each other. And so he likens perception itself to a language. He says it's a language before language, just as there's a time before time. So yeah, perception itself is already linguistic, and this is what allows an infant to understand like the experience of red as red, but it's not like a word, right? It's rather a system of interlocking meanings, which are given to us through different sensory modalities, and each one has like a corresponding motor or affect. Yeah, and that itself is, yeah, he likens it to language, but I would say it's pre-linguistic, but it is like, yeah, a kind of language before language.
Cool.
Yes, and I guess it's also because meaning for Merleau-Ponty is embodied, right? And it's embodied in the fleshiness of our existence. And sort of language for Merleau-Ponty is unable to capture this fleshiness. And actually what language tries to do in a failed way is to just try to make these meanings sort of explicit, but language always fails in this. Language and thought always fail in this doing, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I
they
guess
never.
Merleau-Ponty is playing with a very carnal conception of what meaning is, and in this sense, there would be a sense of meaning that it cannot be captured by language. That's what I'm trying to say, or by concept.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that meaning which is the remainder, or which transcends or exceeds our ability to consciously grasp it in concepts or in words, is perception. It's the perceptual meaning, which he likens to, he calls the unconscious.
All right. Any further questions or comments for Spore? Well, thank you, Spore. That was a great presentation. Again, as always. Oh,
Thank you.
yeah. Let us move on to our final presentation on Fanon. Keli, you go ahead. Take it away.
Okay, I'm gonna be very short because I'm very sleepy right now. So I'll try to wait. All right, so Okay. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about Fanon and historicity. I'm gonna talk mostly basing, like talking about black skin, white masks. So I can be short. So in black skin, white masks, Fanon is trying to develop a phenomenological exploration of how his own lived experience, his own embodied lived experience as a black man has been shaped by the histories of violence and exploitation of modern colonialism, right? So the point of departure of this work for Fanon is already how historicity is woven in our bodies, how it materializes our bodies, and he's kind of narrating how he realizes that in the moment in which he is aware of how he is racialized, right? So Fanon in this work is precisely trying to explore in this very carnal and vivid language how colonial violence inhabits his own body and the world in which his body is embedded. Is a narration of how the past, or better, the violent cooptation of that past, or the colonization of that past, haunts his body and becomes embodied or becomes lived historicity. Fanon narrates in chapter 5, which is I think the most famous of this work, how you know the story, a little boy in a train sees him and starts pointing at him and saying, "Look, mom, a Negro. Look, mom, a Negro. Look, mom." And Fanon in this chapter narrates how this moment sort of crumbles his own subjectivity, how this moment splits his own body, his own being human in this moment is, let's say, broken, and how this is the moment in which he realizes this. So I'm gonna read this quote from chapter 5. I open the quote. This is after he narrates the moment that I just told you about. He says, "I was responsible at the same time for my body, for my race, for my ancestors. I subjected myself to an objective examination. I discovered my blackness, my ethnic characteristics. On that day, completely dislocated, unable to be abroad with the other, the white man who mercifully imprisoned me. I took myself far off from my own presence, far indeed, and made myself an object. What else could it be for me but an amputation, an excision, a hemorrhage that spattered my whole body with black blood? But I did not want this revision, this thematization. All I wanted was to be a man among other men." So what Fanon is trying to say here is how in this moment he realizes the way in which his body is experienced as a body that is always for others, or for the white gaze, in which the organic bond between the subject, the body, and the world has crumbled. Because it is precisely the historicity of colonialism what has wounded this sort of organic bond between the body and the world. So the episode of the boy in the train reveals for Fanon a historic and racial layer of significance of his own body. And in here, he's placing a critique to Merleau-Ponty, saying that for him, in his reality, in his lived experience as a Black man, there is no such organic bond between my body and the world, precisely because history wounded that organic bond, right? And in this sense, how do I say this? In this sense, Merleau-Ponty is, for Fanon, kind of presupposing the position of the white man within this colonized present, right? Because it's precisely the white man who can have this organic and fluid bond between his body and the world. So what Fanon is trying to reflect on here is how materiality, the materiality of his own body, is shaped by historical, political, and economic conditions of existence, and how these conditions are, as I have already said, deeply weaved in our bodies and our lived experience. But furthermore, it's about how the intersubjective character of our existence is weaved in our own being, right? And how the materiality, our fleshiness, is sort of inserted in a historical field. Mm-hmm. So what Fanon is doing here is not an abstract reflection of what historicity is ontologically, but he is developing what I think is a phenomenological reflection on embodiment in a way that is fully situated, fully concrete, and from his own experience, he's able to question and criticize our present, right? So for Fanon, I think that Fanon takes the phenomenological point of departure, that is that the body is the starting point of reflection, more seriously than other phenomenologists that I have read. Okay, yes. And Fanon sort of expresses this way of articulating how history is woven in our bodies through the notion of sociogen. So Fanon is trying to explain how race, racism, and racialization cannot be explained by giving account, for example, of biological circumstances, or how they cannot be addressed by giving account of the development of the subject or the individual, but rather how we have to consider that racism, racialization, and race have been materially produced within history. So he's criticizing the thought that these things are given, and is rather telling to us that this has been produced by very concrete and specific systems of domination and exploitation, of course related to colonialism. So for Fanon, sociogen is trying to point out how our being emerges through the human forces that have brought it into existence. So he's trying to reflect on how we are product of, or how we have been materialized within a history that in which that humans have made. That's what I'm trying to make, and how this history is fully immanent and fully the product of human action, right? And as such this materialization of history falls into the responsibility of humans, right? So it's immanent. And of course, not all humans in the same way, right? So in this way, through the notion of sociogeny, Fanon is criticizing the notion of phylogeny by Darwin and ontogenesis in Freud, arguing that these two notions are unable to give account of the lived experience of the racialized. For Fanon, both biology and subjectivity are interwoven with history and sociality. All right. So this is a dimension of what historicity means for Fanon, a dimension in which historicity is sort of a condition of possibility of our existence and how we are materialized as we are within this history, making our being part of this historicity. The other side of that I see, so historicity has another side in Fanon's thought. So he's not just saying that history inhabits our flesh and materializes our flesh, but that historicity itself has been captured and appropriated by our colonial present. So for Fanon, the way we inhabit our past and the way the past is brought to us, and the way in which we live the past has been, according to Fanon, also colonized. In the sense that colonial systems of exploitation and domination enclose the colonized in a painful belonging to a past that is alienating and alienated, right? So the colonized sort of gets fixated in this colonial construction of the past in a way that forecloses the possibilities for being of those that are exploited. So I'm gonna read a quote from the same chapter of Black Skins, White Masks. Fanon says, "I was responsible at the same time for my body, for my race, for my ancestors. I subjected myself to an objective examination. I discovered my blackness, my ethnic characteristics, and I was battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial defects, slave ships, and above all else, above all, sugar eating." Right? So what Fanon is saying is that is not only that our lived experience as the lived experience of Black people as colonized and enslaved has been shaped by this violence that occurred, but that the way in which this past is brought into lived experience has already a colonial structure, right? So sort of this history that has been created by whiteness sort of drags me down and fixates me in the past, which is all these stereotypes. So he says all these stories, all these images, all these symbolisms are woven into my flesh and drag me down. And this moment of racialization is the moment in which I realized the materiality of this weight, or of this facticity. So in this sense, the colonization of the past makes the past a closed one that has exhausted all the possibilities, not all the possibilities, but has exhausted possibilities for invention. So what happens here is that the complexity of the past is reduced to flatness, fixing the racialized into the colonized past that the colonizer materializes in many ways. Among those, for example, the attempt to erase the historical memory of colonized people. A crucial part of many of the colonial projects was to sort of steal many of the ways in which these communities were able to have a historicity, right? In a sense that this past, in a very material way, if you go to museums, you can see that all the stolen artifacts steal the ways in which a community can build a relation with their past, right? But another side of this colonization of the past is a politics of oblivion. So, while this sort of stereotype image of the colonized past is sort of reproduced by histories and images and many discursive practices, the violence of colonization is sort of effaced and forgotten, even though such violence is actually the condition of possibility for the colonial order, right? So it is for this reason that for Fanon, this colonized historicity or this colonized relation with the past cannot be the source of agency and invention, or for possibilities for the future. For Fanon, such relation with the past has to be liquidated. And in this, he doesn't mean just destruction of this relation with the past, but sort of reinvented, I cannot say this word. Move. Making it move. Remobilize, I don't know.
Remobilized. Yeah.
Remobilized,
Yeah, yeah.
Not only destroyed, right? In order to open possibilities for the reinvention of humanity itself. So he says in the conclusion of Black Skin, White Masks, and I open quote, he says, moral anguish in the face of the massiveness of the past. I am a Negro, and a tons of chains, storms of blows, rivers, and expectoration flow down my shoulders. But I do not have the right to allow myself to bog down. I do not have the right to allow the slightest fragment to remain in my existence. I do not have the right to allow myself to be mired in what the past has determined. I am not the slave of the slavery that dehumanized my ancestors. So this sort of relation with the past, which many people interpret as a total break from the past and a reinvention of humanity itself, which he will develop later in The Wretched of the Earth with his reflections on violence. People interpret this as a total break with the past, right? But for me, what I'm trying to suggest is that for Fanon, this means a total break or a liquidation. You know what I mean? You know, okay, of the colonized past, of colonized historicity, not of all historicity, right? And I think under this light, we can maybe see on a different perspective his reflections both on violence and on temporality. And why Fanon put so much emphasis on futurity and reinvention. Yes, so he writes later in The Wretched of the Earth, I think this is the last paragraph of The Wretched of the Earth. He says, we must make a new start, develop a new way of thinking, and endeavor to create a new man. Yeah, so what I'm trying to say is that there are many interpretations of Fanon's interpretation of historicity as kind of apocalyptic and sort of dismissive of the past. But what I'm trying to say is that perhaps what Fanon is trying to say is that we need to break with historicity, with the historicity that has been colonized and the relation with our past that has been colonized. This doesn't mean that all past should just be forgotten and erased and just move on, right? So I think under this light, perhaps we can think with Fanon sort of the relation that colonized communities have with their past. I'm thinking about, for example, with the indigenous communities whose relation with tradition and with ancestors and with a past that was stolen from them becomes a crucial source of resistance and political action, right? And yeah, and I think that's what I had. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Oh my goodness, this is so fantastic and so interesting to just circle back. Sorry, I always circle back to Husserl, but with Husserl's notion of historicity, he paints this picture of, oh, cultures just naturally begin with this animism, this reverence for ancestors who are still with us, and sort of the immediate, sort of like maybe pagan grasp that we have on the world, and then we just naturally, this theoretical attitude emerges out of nowhere. It's the transcendental ego, but really it just seems like, I mean, when you look at Plato and Aristotle, who Husserl references, is really codifying this theoretical attitude into us science. Their theories are always accompanied by very strict political regime. We have Plato's theory of knowledge reflected in the Republic. We have these strict hierarchies. Some are meant to be slaves, and some are meant to be the merchants, and some are meant to be philosopher kings, or this, that, and the other. And Aristotle has his aristocracy that represents, the higher faculties of reason. And the narrative that Husserl tells is somewhat touches on this colonial attitude. We have this aberration in the history of of science where, oh, we can master ourselves and our environment. And so this leads to the mathematization of nature, and that sort of, we've brought this alienation from our humanity upon ourselves. But with Fanon, we have this alienation that wasn't chosen by ourselves, it was placed upon us by the colonializers. And like maybe this theoretical attitude isn't as innocent as Husserl, claims it to be, or isn't so natural. It's not as if the transcendental ego must, fulfill itself through scientific reflection, or at least theoretical reflection. Like that could just be a narrative we tell ourselves to maybe cover over just what that theoretical attitude accompanies, or even maybe justifies or rationalizes. So I really appreciate that perspective of how that historicity is forced upon him through his blackness. And it wasn't something that, we did to ourselves because we just misunderstood nature. Like, that was forced upon us. And maybe that distinction can help us in our reconsidering what it means to be man. Like, how do we distinguish between the historicity that we need to get rid of and then the history that we can maybe learn from and build upon in our new construction? And this is just speculative and me rambling, not a question, more of a comment, but maybe that's where we can start dividing what can go and what can stay. Is that this
Yeah, definitely. So there is this philosopher, thinker in general, called Sylvia Wynter. I don't know if you know her. So she retakes Fanon's call for rethinking the human itself, right? And in this rethinking of the human itself, Wynter says we have to both give account of how coloniality has shaped our existence, but also we need to go back into a human past in order to see and reinvent ourselves beyond this colonial historicity. And she has very interesting reflections about evolution and how language opened our existence to invention, and she rooted this in Africa and sort of the history of evolution. So she's creating her own historical narration as a site of resistance and a site of redefining what it means to be human beyond the way in which the colonial world attempts to capture the meaning of humanity, right? And you see it in the theoretical perspectives that we just heard about today. We talk about the human all the time in a neutral way, as it is something that is given, while the way in which these philosophies reflect about the human, perhaps for Fanon, is showing that they're reflecting from a very situated and particular side that has, or that they aim to universalize and to become the representation of about what it means to be human, right? Yeah.
Very nice. Any more questions or comments? I know it's especially getting late for you, Angela, over there. What time is it over there for you now?
It's 1 right now.
Oh, sure. Oh, and we had a longer chop shop than usual today. So, whew. But any final questions for our very tired presenter? Okay. Well, thank you so much for your presentations and for those who joined us today with their questions and comments. They were great, made for great conversation. And I guess we'll see you next time, everybody.